Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel, I share real life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was halfway through a double shift when it happened. I drove delivery vans for a courier company. Nights and early mornings, all the stuff nobody wanted to wait on during the day. That night, I'd left the Bronx hub around 2:10 a.m. with a loaded Sprinter and a list that took me through the northeast side and then back across the Cross Bronx to the west. It was foggy, that soup kind that turns streetlights into fuzzy moons and makes the world feel smaller, pressed down. I like the fog sometimes. It keeps drivers slow and the city quiet. My name's Carlos. I'd been doing this work for 3 years. I know every weird little thing a van can do, every rattle and blink. I also know my route. I'd driven under that overpass on East Tremont 100 times. There's a stretch there where the road dips and the viaduct makes the fog thicken for a block like someone's hanging a curtain. The first odd thing was small and I almost ignored it. My phone GPS started lagging a beat when I turned off the Bruckner, like it couldn't pick up satellites in the low canyon of concrete. That happens sometimes in the city. Tall structures block signals. I tapped the nav and kept going. The van's dash clock flashed 2:43 and then relit itself. I thought the truck's battery was being picky. The radio was on, a low talk station to keep me awake, and the host's voice warbled for a second into a soft buzzing. Static, bounced and gone. I figured the weather was getting to the electronics. As I approached the overpass, headlights bled out from alleyways and storefronts like dull stars. The fog made everything feel like it was happening in a dream. Muffled, slowed down. A few other cars were pulled on the shoulder, people leaning against hoods and craning their necks, which is unusual this late unless there's a real issue. I slowed because that's what you do. You don't want to be the idiot who plows through something everyone else is stopping for. The overpass came into view, half swallowed by mist. I could see shapes lodged in the fog, like someone had hung blankets over the city. There was a faint metallic sheen in one of those shapes, just on the edge of the light cast by a sodium lamp. At first, it looked like the underside of a semi parked on the overpass. Then I realized it wasn't on the overpass. It was above it, hovering maybe 10 feet over the roadway, half hidden by the fog like it was shy. Its surface caught the streetlight and flicked a cold silver back at me. It didn't have lights or anything that would tell me it was a drone. No blinking navigation lamps, no obvious means of propulsion. It looked like a curved plate, sort of boomerang shaped, and it didn't make a sound. I remember thinking, cleanly and absurdly, that I should be able to hear something. Even a cheap drone makes a little whine. Nothing. The fog smothered every other noise like it was a blanket. A driver in a cab in front of me pulled over and killed his lights. I did the same. A couple of people climbed out of their cars with phones held up, filming. The metallic thing rotated maybe a degree and reflected the light differently. For a second, it looked like it had texture, ridges, seams. Then it smoothed again, like a skin pulling taut. I checked my mirror. Headlights were lined behind me for a long way, cars slowing and stopping because one of us had stopped. No one honked. Everyone just watched. My hands were on the wheel and I felt my mouth go dry. My headlight beam made a weak halo in the fog. The van's engine hummed. The streetlight over the overpass flickered once, then stayed. The GPS bubble on my phone jittered as if confused, then froze and spun like it had lost an orbit. I tried to pull the phone from the mount to take a video and the screen blacked out. The phone lit up again with the passcode screen, but the camera app crashed the moment I tapped it. I remember saying, "Come on, come out loud." An older woman from a minivan across the lane walked up the shoulder and called out a question I couldn't quite hear. The metallic shape tilted toward her like it was acknowledging, though it made no motion, that a body would. She waved her hand, and then after a beat, she put it down and turned back toward her car. Her face was white in the light, but she wasn't panicking, more like stunned. When I finally started up the van again and nudged forward, the thing hadn't moved, which meant I had to drive under it. I told myself I was being ridiculous for thinking anything special would happen. I pulled under the overpass slow, the fog swallowing the front end of the van, and felt the temperature drop a notch, just a notch, like opening the freezer door in the cab for a second. The radio squealed and gave a thin layered tone that set my teeth on edge for a moment and then went normal. My left turn signal blinked twice and the dash dinged like someone tapped it. The metallic shape was directly above the roadway, the silver reflecting off the wet asphalt. For an instant, I thought I felt pressure on the van's roof, a lightness that made my hair prickle. I glanced at the GPS as I came out the other side, expecting to see the spinning blue dot come back to life on the route. Instead, the map recentered, and the nav announced, calm and wrong, recalculating, proceed to the highlighted route. My heart did that small flip you get when you step on a hidden hole. The little blue dot on the screen was not on East Tremont anymore. It was back on the Bruckner, where I had turned off, like my position had jumped 3 blocks backward. The timestamp on the nav showed 2:50. I knew the trip under the overpass had taken maybe 7-8 seconds. The clock by my visor said 2:52. The van's odometer didn't lie. I hadn't driven in a way that would explain the GPS repositioning. I pulled over at the next safe shoulder with the hazard lights on and killed the engine. People behind me crawled past, shaking their heads and talking fast. A kid in a hoodie hailed me from the sidewalk and asked if I'd seen the same thing. When I opened the van door, my head felt fuzzy for a second, like I'd been spinning. The air smelled the same as always, rain, exhaust, hot tar, but there was that thin hum under everything, the same low tone I'd felt under the overpass. My phone had reconnected to the network by then. Messages stacked up, texts from dispatch asking where I was, 2 missed calls. My navigation history was a mess. The app logged my position as having jumped and then returned and then skipped again. I told dispatch I needed a minute, said I'd been delayed, kept it simple. The kid who'd hailed me told me his watch had pushed forward 5 minutes and then reset. A woman from a hybrid behind me said her car clock had flashed 12 and then lined up with the streetlight time. Electronics were acting up across the board. I finished my route because that's what you do when you work nights. You keep going. The fog thinned little by little as the shift wore on and the skyline began to take on the hard edges of dawn. The weirdness receded like tidewater. A couple of other drivers called later to compare notes, and their stories matched in the odd, useful parts. A metallic shape over an overpass, no sound, phones glitching, clocks wrong. People who weren't out there that night later said they saw nothing, and that was fine. It was easier to pretend you'd missed it or that it had been a misty highway light. When I got back to the depot at 6 a.m., my supervisor, Carl, looked at the log and raised an eyebrow. He said GPS glitches happen, weird power surges happen, fog does funny things. He had seen stuff in 20 years, frozen bridges, drivers asleep at the wheel, angry customers with keys. He didn't scoff, but his face was the kind that wanted to move on. We all did. We stacked the parcels, drank stale coffee, made jokes about phantom overpasses. At home that afternoon, I checked my instrument cluster out of habit. The van had no damage, and the roof, where I'd felt that light pressure, was clean. I tried playing back the dash cam footage. The file had a gap of about 20 seconds where, for no reason, the image went black. There was no sound during the missing section either. I've never had footage up and die like that without corrupting the whole file. I told my brother about it over the phone, and he laughed, half convinced I was pranking him, then got serious when I told him about the clocks and the GPS. He said maybe it was a military test or some tech people with a new toy. I wanted that to be true. I wanted a tidy answer. It didn't come. I still drive that route. I drive under that overpass with my hands on the wheel and the radio on low. I slow down a little more than I used to. Every once in a while, when the fog rolls in thick and the headlights smear into the night, I think I feel that subtle drop in temperature, like the breath of something passing over. It isn't dramatic, no beams of light, no dramatic vanishings. It's small and precise, the sort of thing that makes you second guess what you think you saw. I made it home every night that week. I was tired, a little jumpy, and oddly protective of my phone. The GPS behaved itself after that. The clock stayed put. the world resumed its sensible ticking. But I still have that sense sometimes, opening my dashboard, that there's a notch of the world where the map can hiccup, where time blinks and the blue dot chooses to lie. I was on the ballast at 2 in the morning, sitting on an upended tie with my back against the rail, when the first little odd thing happened. I was supposed to be doing a routine walkthrough. Check the frogs, make sure the joints were tight, the switch heaters not iced up, but it was the kind of night that slows you down. Warm, heavy air after a thunderstorm earlier, the kind that leaves the gravel smelling like pennies. The city was distant. You could hear I-81 like a low throat in the dark, but otherwise it was just me, my headlamp, and the occasional drip from a leaky culvert. The signal head at the north siding was blinking like it always did, green, amber, red, in the pattern the dispatcher taught us to memorize. I double-checked my clipboard and the small LED on my handheld radio. It was at full charge. I should have been half asleep from the monotony, but something about the silence kept me alert. The radios at the tower crackled every so often with the dispatcher's bored voice, but there were long, empty gaps between calls. No freights, no Amtrak down the main that night. First oddity, the frogs. They usually started up after that kind of rain, a chorus in the low spots along the tracks. That night they were quiet, not a single croak. I noticed it when I stood up to walk the switch, and the absence of their sound made my own footsteps loud enough to hear in the darkness. It felt like the world had pulled a blanket tight and everything small had been smothered. Second oddity came when I checked the crossing gate at Conklin Avenue. The motor hummed when I pushed the manual override to test it. I could hear the gear train, but the red lights above the gate didn't flash. I hit the button again. Still nothing. The lamp was cold to the touch. The motor spun normally, the bell inside clanged, and the flags on the gate swung, but the lights stayed off like someone had unplugged them. I radioed the tower and got static. Not the familiar crackle, but a soft wash of white noise. The tower didn't answer for a full minute, which felt like a long time. I shrugged it off. You learn to shrug off things you don't understand on graveyard shifts, and kept moving. The rails sang under my boots, the familiar iron song when you step between ties. I made a habit of checking my watch at every milepost, so I had an honest log I could hand in at the end of the shift. It was a cheap analog, faded loom on the hands, and it read 2:13 when I paused by MP 4.2. I jotted notes, snapped a photo of the switch with my phone, and felt that small, stupid sense of being exactly where I should be, doing the job I'd been doing for 10 years. The third oddity, my compass. I've used a compass enough to know when it's playing tricks, and mine suddenly took a half turn of hesitation when I pulled it out to check heading. The needle wobbled like it was confused, then settled in a direction that didn't make sense, pointed a few degrees east of true north. I tapped it and brought it up to the north rail. Maybe a stray magnet in a toolbox, I thought. I stood there and looked at the sky. The clouds had thinned to a thin lattice of stars, and Orion was where he usually is this time of year. Still, the compass kept that little bit of wrongness, like someone had nudged it and left it out of true. It wasn't until I was halfway through the siding with my lamp beam cutting a tight cone across the ties that the main event happened. I'd stopped to wedge a small rock under a loose spike and was hunched over, headlamp angled down, when the world lit up. The light came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't the broad beam of a searchlight that you can track back to a source, and it wasn't like a flare you might find in a car. It was an intense, narrow sweep, a white blade moving across the rails, cutting the darkness with surgical precision. For a few seconds, it painted the ties and ballast and the undersides of the signals in a light so bright I could have read a book by it. The metal of the rail shone like chrome. I heard, in the same instant, nothing at all. No hum, no machinery, not even the far highway. The silence under that light had a shape to it, like sound had been held back by something pressing gently on the air. I looked up because instinct demanded it, but there was nothing visible in the sky. The beam did not come from the stars or from any city light. It moved slowly across my face and hands as if some enormous hand were sweeping a flashlight along the ground from just beyond the tree line. I felt hot where it passed, but not in a way that burned, like standing in front of a car heater set too high. It lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds. Then the beam moved past and the world was left in its regular weathered dark. I blinked, counting the beats like a fool. I checked the watch on my wrist. When I'd been bent over the spike, it was 2:13. Now it read 2:28. My pen dropped from my fingers and skittered across the ballast. 15 minutes missing. I laughed out loud once, a small, useless sound, and said, "Okay, that's not right." I fished my phone out. It had an image, but the last photo file was corrupted, a smear of white with a tiny shadow that could have been me. My camera app froze and had to be restarted. The radio, which had been quiet, that clicked and stuttered like someone retuning. The tower came on a second later, asking if I'd seen a high-intensity inspection light, because apparently that's the kind of bureaucratic explanation they have handy. I told them what I'd seen, and they said 2 other crews reported something similar about the same time, and that the dispatcher at the main line had logged an instrument spike on track circuits near the junction. That made the hair at the back of my neck stand up. Track circuits aren't touchy. They're simple: metal, electricity, logic. Yet there was a blip in the log of a magnitude that made the dispatcher frown on his speaker. I asked if anyone had seen a helicopter or a maintenance flight, and the dispatcher said negative. He asked if I wanted him to call the yard supervisor to come check. I said yes, because it's what you do, even when the only thing you can think of is that you'd misunderstood something. I walked the same stretch again. The beam hadn't left any scorch, no singed ties, no melted rail lubricator. The ballast underfoot was the same damp gray. I listened hard for anything: the small rustle of a night critter, the far groan of a truck, and the world sounded normal in the end. People in the depot exchanged glances that said they'd rather joke about it than admit they were rattled. We make light of the strange to keep it from growing teeth. But there were other small things that clung. A local engineer told me later his pocket watch had wound forward on its own when the beam crossed his car, and then 3 minutes later clicked back to the right time. A brakeman said his handheld gauge that measures signal voltage jumped 20% and then stilled. An old crew chief swore his dog sat at the kitchen window and refused to move for nearly an hour after his shift, like it had smelled something he couldn't. The supervisor arrived about 20 minutes after my call. He was calm in a way that makes you believe him, practical with his lantern and his clipboard. We stood by MP 4.2 and compared notes. He looked at my watch, frowned, and said we should log the time as observed: 2:13 when he'd last seen me proceed past the switch, and 2:28 when I radioed. He wrote it down. Formal records make things real in a desk clerk's world. I went home the next morning, still thinking about the beam. I made my coffee with care and let the flood of day wash the edges off the night. At the breakfast table, I told my wife, out of habit, and she made me show her the watch. She shrugged, said perhaps I'd nodded off and had a dream like anyone else, but she didn't laugh the way she usually did at my midnight stories. She knows the lines on my face when something from the tracks has followed me home. I filed the incident in the log, and the dispatcher made a note, and then it went the long way through the system. A line item to be folded into safety briefings and equipment checks. When the clip with the corrupted photo came up on the security feed later that week, the tech said the image had a bright overexposure, but nothing else. There was no footprint to follow, no source to point at in the night. A couple of nights later, I walked the same ties with another crew. The frogs had come back, the crossing lamps flashed, my compass behaved. Life resumed its little noisy insistence. You learn to accept that the world is larger than your explanations, that sometimes small fractions of your night will be odd like a song with a wrong note. It didn't hurt me, and it didn't take anything I could name. Mostly it left me with a time gap I couldn't account for, and a story that sat in my chest, heavy and precise. When I'm out there now, I check my watch more than I used to. I keep my radio on. Sometimes on a humid night when the air hangs low and the city hum is thin, I can feel for a second like a hand is sliding a flashlight across the yard, and I make myself steady. You get better at living with missing minutes the way you get better at tying knots. Careful, methodical, because the world will always give you a small piece of its unreadable self and expect you to keep going. I usually go out on the Long Island Sound early before dawn when the water is still and the tide hasn't started stirring yet. That morning it was hazy, with a thin fog rolling off the water, and the moon was a pale sliver, barely lighting the horizon. I had my small aluminum boat tied to the dock at Port Jefferson, my tackle boxes loaded, and I was looking forward to a couple of hours fishing before the sun crested the eastern sky. I pushed off and let the boat glide, using the oars to get into deeper water. The water was smooth, almost glassy, and the fog muffled everything. No gulls, no distant boats, nothing but the soft slap of water against the hull. I'd gone maybe a quarter-mile out when I noticed it, a reflection in the water that didn't match anything around me. At first, I thought it was just a buoy catching the moonlight, but it was too big, too bright, and it moved. I stopped rowing and squinted through the fog. It was just above the surface, hovering maybe 10 feet over the water, and it was reflective, almost like polished metal. But it didn't look like a boat or a buoy. No lights, no motor, no wake, nothing. I turned the boat slowly to get a better look, and the shape shifted with me, staying roughly the same distance away, following. I thought maybe it was a seagull, glinting in the moonlight, but it didn't make a sound, and it wasn't flapping. I grabbed my flashlight, a mag light I keep in a waterproof case, and aimed it at the object. The moment the beam hit it, it jerked straight up, faster than anything I've ever seen, and vanished into the mist. There was no splash, no streak of condensation, nothing. 1 second it was hovering there, the next, gone. I blinked, shaking my head. Maybe it was a trick of the fog, a reflection of the dock lights far behind me, but my stomach sank in a way that made me grip the oars tight. I kept moving slowly, trying to see if it would reappear, scanning the fog. For a few minutes there was nothing. The water was calm again, the silence thick. I could hear my own breathing, my pulse, and the faint lapping of water. Then it happened again. Out of the corner of my eye, a bright, reflective shape appeared on the horizon, barely visible through the fog. I froze, my hands gripping the oars. It stayed there, just hovering, following me silently. I tried to calculate distance and size. It was hard because there were no reference points, just fog and water, but it seemed huge compared to my little boat. I didn't want to move closer. Something in me told me to stay put, but I couldn't look away. I aimed the flashlight again. It jerked upward sharply, then tilted sideways, moving at an angle so fast I lost track of it. When I looked back toward the horizon, it was gone. The fog had thickened slightly, the world reduced to a narrow circle around my boat, and nothing stirred. I started rowing toward shore, cautiously, keeping my eyes on the fog. Every now and then I thought I saw a shimmer in the mist, something reflecting light at impossible angles, but each time I blinked, it was gone. I couldn't hear any motors, any birds, any wind, just the water around my oars. My watch told me I'd been out only 10 minutes, but the light, the shape, and the timing didn't make sense. My head kept replaying the moment it shot upward. It moved too fast, too deliberately to be natural. By the time I reached the dock, the fog had thinned and the sun was starting to color the horizon pale pink. I tied up the boat, hands still shaking. I looked out over the water, hoping to see some trace of it. Nothing. The sound was empty, quiet, the docks empty except for me. I went home, kept thinking about it, the reflective shape, the way it moved without sound. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some new kind of research drone, military testing, a trick of the water and fog. But nothing added up. A drone that big, moving like that, and following me without sound or lights? Impossible. Later, I called a buddy, Jim, who does some small boat maintenance out in Port Jefferson. He laughed at first, asked if I'd been out too late, then got quiet when I insisted I wasn't joking. He said there'd been reports from other fishermen recently, people saying they'd seen strange reflections above the water, moving in ways that made no sense. He didn't give me names or dates, just that it wasn't the first sighting that week. Since then, I've been back out on the Sound, mornings and evenings. Nothing. Some mornings the fog is thick enough to make the water look silver, almost magical. and I find myself staring at it, half expecting that shape to appear again. My boat, my flashlight, my oars, they all feel the same, but I know something isn't right out there. The reflection, the way it followed me silently, the speed it moved, it didn't belong in our world. I don't tell a lot of people. You can't explain it. You can say fog, reflection, drone, but nothing lines up. I keep going out, mostly because I love the water, but sometimes when I'm alone in the boat, I swear I catch a glint on the horizon and my heart picks up, my stomach twists. I look at my watch, check the fog, check the sky, and just like before, it's gone. But I know it's out there, or it was, and I know that if I'm patient enough, if I wait in the fog long enough, I might see it again. The sound has always been quiet, always been calm, but that morning, it wasn't. And I keep wondering what it was, what it wanted, and why it followed me, silently, without a sound, over the water. I was walking the service road above the dunes because I couldn't sleep. It was one of those late June mornings where the air is already heavy and the sky promises sun but hasn't decided how loudly to get there. I like to walk that stretch by the old Montauk military base, not on the base itself, obviously, but the access road that runs behind the fenced-off area. It's quiet up there before the tourists wake and the dogs and the ATVs get out. I usually go at dawn to see the light come up over the sound side, but that morning the tide was low and the beach smelled like kelp and fried plankton, and I needed the sound of the waves to slow my thoughts. My name's Eli. I run the bait shop on Montauk Highway when I'm in town. I'd worked a late shift the night before and couldn't get comfortable, so I grabbed my windbreaker and headed out around 3:45. The sky was a dull gray with a smear of orange starting east toward the horizon. There weren't many people. One fisherman set up near the rocks, a couple in sleeping bags on the far end of the beach, and a jogger who turned around when he saw me. The place felt familiar and small in that in-between hour. The first odd thing was the wind. There wasn't any. The dunes are usually noisy with wind and the dry whisper of grass. That morning, the grass lay flat and the ocean was a soft, steady hiss instead of the normal crash. I noticed it because the sound changed in a way that made me look up. Then I saw the ripples on the water, delicate, oddly regular, and for a second I thought a boat must be out there in the fog. There wasn't. No silhouette, no wake. I kept walking, hands in my pockets, and tried to tell myself I was just tired. My phone said 3:52, but the battery was down to 19% for no reason. That was the second small oddity. I switched it off after a moment because I didn't want to waste the little charge. It was one of those cheap meters, and it never liked cold. The clouds were low and patchy, the kind that eats the first light. It felt like the day was holding its breath. About halfway along the road, I saw a soft glow over the dunes. Not the bright, whiter glare of a flashlight, but a gentle, spherical bloom, like someone had set a paper lantern down behind the grass. It rose out of the dune line slowly, not popping into being so much as unwinding itself from the sand. At first, I thought it'd be some tourist with a lantern doing a photo shoot. Montauk has that kind of thing sometimes. I kept walking toward it anyway because curiosity is cheap and the beach is small. The glow was a perfect sphere, maybe 2 feet in diameter, floating just above the dune grass at first. It didn't bob or wobble, it lifted cleanly and there was no sound at all. No hum, no whir, nothing mechanical. The only thing I noticed besides the light was a faint ozone smell, like after a thunderstorm but sharper, metallic. That smell hit me before I even saw the sphere clearly. It made my tongue taste like pennies. When the sphere rose above the dunes, it didn't have a clear edge the way a lamp does. The light seemed to come from within it and around it, like it was both object and glow. It moved over the beach slowly and deliberately, not with the jittery movement of a drone, but with a smooth, floaty quality, like it wasn't subject to wind the way everything else was. The fog down by the water made the halo look larger. For a moment, my brain offered rational things: remote-controlled toy, weather balloon, some art installation. None of them fit. I wasn't the only one watching. The fisherman had his rod propped up and was standing with his hands on his hips. The couple in the sleeping bags sat up. The jogger had stopped 10 yards back and was looking like he'd forgotten to breathe. A few cars idling near the road had drivers craning out, phone screens up, flashlights pointed. Nobody made a sound except the surf. The sphere moved out over the ocean. I could see its reflection, a bright round on the glass flat water, and as it drifted, the reflection separated from it by a thin space of darker water. For an instant, the light rode above its own reflection as if there were two layers of air. The ozone smell got stronger. It wasn't unpleasant, just wrong in that it didn't belong at a beach at dawn. When it cleared the dunes, it gained a little altitude and began to drift along the shoreline parallel to the water, maybe 30 yards offshore. The way it moved was so calm it felt rehearsed. It kept steady acceleration and speed, which made everything look staged, except it wasn't. The couple on the sands stood and held each other, and the fisherman muttered, "I'll be damned," like that explained anything. The jogger's phone battery died mid-recording, and his video stopped with a frozen frame of the sphere and a little error icon. He cursed in a hoarse voice. After a few minutes of that slow drift, the sphere paused over a darker patch of water where eelgrass sometimes breaks the surface at low tide. Then it did something small and precise. It dimmed almost imperceptibly, and a ring of light at its equator rotated once, like the band around the middle twisted, and then settled. The ocean didn't ripple. The whole thing felt clinical, like a lab experiment. I thought, absurdly, that whatever it was might have instruments and a checklist. I know how ridiculous that sounds. Checklist, in the middle of a beach at dawn. But you can't help the thinking your brain does when something breaks its rules. Then the sphere began to rise. It didn't accelerate quickly. It lifted steadily, gaining height over the water until it was maybe 20 feet up. The reflection thinned out on the water and then pinched off, and for a second I could see stars that the cloud had been hiding. The sphere drifted away from shore and over the mouth of the bay, like it was going out to sea. As it moved, the smell of ozone followed, just faint enough that I kept worrying I was imagining it. I started back toward the dune road because the scene felt private, and I didn't want to be caught in a crowd or on film as someone who'd lost his mind. Halfway up the path, I heard a sound for the first time. Glass on glass, thin and far, like the clink of ice in a glass. It wasn't close enough to be from any of the people on the beach. I stopped, looked back, and saw the sphere as a dot in the gray sky. It was heading straight out, no faltering. The jogger came up behind me and said, "Did you get any of that?" He sounded small. His hands were trembling a little, like he'd been holding something way too hot. I shook my head. My own voice felt like someone else's. At the top of the dunes, where the road curves around the fence line of the old base, I noticed a second oddity. The maintenance gate to the base had been padlocked for years, but this morning its chain lay slack and the lock was on the sand at its feet, untouched and closed. That made no sense. I know the gate. The county checks it. I walked up and kicked at the sand around the lock to see if someone had been there and left tracks. There were none. The sand was half-inch crusted from dusk and the wind, unbroken. It made my skin feel like something had been rubbed along my arms. I stood there for a long time, hearing the ocean and a far gull and nothing else. Eventually the sphere disappeared over the horizon, as if the sky had simply swallowed it. The light fell away, the fog thickened a touch, and the world righted itself by degrees. Wind coming back to the grass, a dog far down the road barking, a plane making a small sound like a bee. The jogger looked at his phone with an expression I knew too well. Embarrassed. Because you want validation and you don't want to be seen as crazy. I walked back to my car, slow. My phone's battery had stabilized at 12% and the screen showed no new messages. When I turned the key, the dashboard clock blinked and went to 4:21, though the shop clock at the bait store later told me I'd left at 3:45. I blamed road time and old electronics because that's what you do when you want to keep your bearings. Work that morning ran the usual way. People came for bait, for beer, for that early hard coffee. The town felt normal, small and useful and stubbornly ordinary. A woman buying morning clams asked if I'd seen any weird lights on her way in from the East End. She'd seen nothing but fog. A fisherman told me his buddy offshore swore he saw a ball of light, but his binoculars fogged. People passed by the topic like it was a math problem no one wanted to solve. That night I lay awake thinking about the sphere, thinking about the silence that preceded it, and the way the ozone smelled like metal. It wasn't threatening in a cartoon sense. No beams, no tractors of beam lights, no forcible taking of anyone. It was quiet and precise and too controlled. There was a patient intelligence to the motion. That was the thing that made me uneasy. How ordinary it seemed while being utterly outside ordinary rules. I didn't tell many people at first. When you start describing a glowing sphere that drifts over the sea and leaves the air smelling like pennies, faces fold into sympathetic comedy or Bayou coffee doubt. My buddy Marco laughed and said maybe we'd both fallen asleep at our posts. My sister sent a string of crying, laughing emojis when I tried to sketch the thing and texted her a photo from a stock site of a lantern and asked if it looked like that. It didn't. I went back to the dunes a week later at dawn, the way some people go back to a road where their car broke down to see if anything left a mark. The sand showed only wheel ruts and dog prints. The padlock at the gate was solid and the chain taut. The fisherman was there again, the same man maybe, and he waved. He'd seen nothing since. The jogger's phone still had that error icon where his footage had ended. Sometimes I'll stand on the bluff at dusk and watch the horizon and think about the quiet. I still smell ozone in thunderstorms and wonder if it's a memory traction, if our noses keep a record that our minds won't. The sphere didn't offer itself up for study. It came, it moved, it left, and life went on. I made my deliveries, sold bait, fixed hooks, and night I walked the same service road because it was where I had seen the world do something it hadn't promised to do. The ocean kept its own counsel, the sky rolled toward morning, and somewhere out past the break, the water reflected light the way it always had. It was a Tuesday in July, the kind of humid that made you feel sticky even after you took a shower. I was walking home from the bar on Lark Street, a slow, stupid walk, bottle in a paper bag, shoes squeaking on the sidewalk, because my car was in the shop and I like stretching my legs when I can. The city smelled like pizza and cut grass and the kind of diesel that comes off the buses. It was around 11:30 by the deli clock as I passed the corner of Madison and Henry. People were still sitting on stoops, windows open, radios leaking music. I noticed the first thing before I even saw anyone stop talking. The sound dropped out. It wasn't a gradual hush. 1 second there was a guy on a porch telling a story. The next there was this empty, thick silence, like someone pressed a hand over the city. You could hear your own breath. A couple of people looked up at the same time like we just learned how to see. A kid 20 feet ahead of me froze mid-step. I kept walking because that's what you do when you think you're alone and being weirded out. Then a woman on the corner tapped the metal box of the streetlight and cursed. And the whole lamp popped, then went dark. Her phone lit just long enough to show her face, and then it blinked off. A man at a bus stop shook his head and said, "Must be the grid." But he had this look of disbelief. By the next block, there were more lights out. The whole block between State and Broadway had gone black, like someone had cut a sheet of night across the street. Car radios fracked into static when drivers tried to crank them. Inside a corner deli, the neon went dead, and the refrigerator hummed a higher, thinner note for a second, before everything settled into quiet again. Someone in a second-floor apartment shouted down that their TV had gone out mid-game. I kept my head up and watched people start to gather. A cluster formed near the bus shelter, neighbors I'd seen before, guys who worked nights with the sanitation crew, a woman with her laundry basket still in her hands. Someone pulled out a cigarette and struck a match, the small flare looking ridiculous in the dark. There was no panic. Mostly there was this animal curiosity, that slow spread of people who wanted to compare notes. Then the phones came alive with nervous tapping. For a minute, the tiny white screens made a constellation of faces lit in blue. Signal bars dipped for half a second, then came back like nothing had happened. That made people laugh, a brittle sound that didn't last. A kid took a video of the darkened street, and the laugh cracked off his lips like an afterthought. The first strange physical thing that pushed past curiosity into real unease was the birds. There used to be pigeons roosting on the ledge of the old bank building by the Hudson. That night, when the lights went out, every one of them launched at once. Normally, birds are loud and messy when they take off. These were quiet, like someone had muffled their wings. They vectored east and then stopped, hovering in the wash of the last traffic light like someone holding up a sheet. Then, as the people watched, the pigeons dispersed and the noise went with them. Nothing, absolutely nothing, like the city had been put into a soft pause. It's impossible to describe the blue without sounding like a cartoon. It was pale, like the inside of a glow stick, only cleaner, less chemical. It appeared above the city in a way lights rarely do. Low, not at aircraft altitude, but just above rooftop level. I saw it first as a smear out by the river, then it moved, or maybe it was always moving and I just caught up with it. People pointed. Someone said, "Is that a drone?" But there was no sound, no rotors, nothing mechanical, and drones don't throw that kind of color. They aren't supposed to look like this. Quiet, steady, not blinking. The glow drifted east along the river, moving like a hand pulling a sheet, slow and deliberate. It lit the water in a pale wash, made everything it passed look slightly washed out and too bright at the edges. Folks stopped in the middle of the street and held their phones up, trying to film, but the little cameras sucked the light into a smear, and the footage looked flat, like someone had filmed through fog. A woman in a summer dress had her hair pinned back with a clip. When she raised her hand to shade her eyes, the light reflected off the metal like mercury. People began to say things that made less sense the more they were repeated. "It's just some promotional drone," a man with a bike said, as if the city would advertise this way. The woman from the deli shook her head and said she'd seen lights like this once before when her boss worked overnight at the airport, and it was only once. Someone else said their neighbor across the park had photos from the 90s of lights that looked the same, a thing grandparents whisper about. The pale glow kept moving, and it slowed as it crossed the streetlights on Washington Avenue. It hovered for a long minute, long enough for me to count the number of cracks in the pavement and see a moth beat its wings off a lamppost. And I felt very clearly like an animal being watched. Not a watching with eyes, but with attention, as if something was making an effort to take stock of us. There were small, odd electrical effects. Car dashboards flashed. A couple of apartment clocks blinked and reset. I heard one old man mutter that his radio had gone to static and then to a symphony for 1 second, as if two stations overlapped just long enough to make something new. Someone's outside floodlight on a stoop sputtered and then turned a different color, a greenish tint, like someone had poured a filter over it. When the glow finally moved on, it didn't shoot away. It faded, slowly, like breathing out. The whole river looked like someone had eased dimmer switches back and everything returned at unity. Streetlights blinked on, storefronts clicked back to life, the hum of refrigerators and ACs returned. The silence broke like a snapped cable. A man started clapping in a nervous, relieved way, and others joined. A thin chorus of laughter trying to clear the night. I walked the last 2 blocks home because cars were stalled on both sides, and all through the neighborhood, you could feel people standing in doorways, comparing what they'd seen. When I opened my building's door, the hallway light came on, like it always did. The elevator was stuck between floors with a group of college kids in it, red-faced and talking over each other about how their phones had all set themselves to 1 a.m. and then snapped back. My apartment building's old analog clock on the wall read 11:28. My phone said 12:31. I shrugged, told myself the bars had glitched. Heat, humidity, messing with things. A small blackout. Erin was half asleep on the couch with the TV set to a muted show. She sat up when I walked in, asking if I'd been mugged because I looked pale. I told her about the light and the birds and the way the city went quiet, and she made me say it all without interruption. She listened the way people who are awake at 1 a.m. do, with half of her attention, and then she's gone again to the world of sleep. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay on my back while the house worked through its cycles. The fridge hummed, the AC kicked and stopped, and I thought about the way the light had looked when it moved over the Hudson. There was no sense of malevolence, not really. It felt like a presence that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the city itself, as if it was reading the place like a page. The next morning, the news ran with the story, but very low on the crawl. Electrical anomaly reported downtown. Con Edison investigating. One anchor said like it was a boilerplate. Neighborhood groups on social media filled up with people who'd seen the same thing. Varying accounts, blurry photos, jokes. Someone posted a grainy video of the glow reflected off the river. You could barely make it out. A utility worker commented that no transformers had blown, that the outage had been localized and temporary, and that crews found nothing wrong. A lot of people wanted an explanation and got the company's calm words instead. A few of the small things stuck with me and didn't get explained. My smartwatch, which is usually obsessively accurate, logged a 15-minute gap where nothing recorded. I had walked home, but the chart showed me stationary. Mrs. Kearney from the second floor told me her old clock radio had tuned itself to a station she didn't have access to and played something classical she swore she'd never heard. Across the river, a friend who works the night shift at the port said the buoys had registered a spike on their sensors and then settled like nothing had happened. The pigeons? A neighbor in a top-floor apartment said that her roosting birds migrated for a week after that night and didn't come back for days. I started to notice other nights when things would go quiet in the city for a second. Not a blackout, not a power hiccup. More like the world was clearing its throat. Sometimes there'd be a low hum you could only feel in the teeth. Sometimes a flicker of pale color on the water if the humidity was right. I don't tell people much anymore. It sounds odd spelled out, and most of the time people want a tidy answer. They want the utility company to say transformer, they want to be told it was a drone show, or reflection, or kids with flashlights. I want that too, sometimes, the clean remove of explanation. But the blue light came low and quiet over the river and took its time looking at us before it left, and we were left with our ordinary lamps and our ordinary hum of appliances and a weird little pause in our nights. It felt like the city had been under a soft, inquisitive gaze, and then whatever had been looking moved on like a thing that had finished reading a page and closed the book. I was on the night shift at the small private airfield just outside Buffalo. It's one of those places where the lights only come on when someone's here, and for the most part, it's quiet, dead quiet. I'd been working there for a little over a year, mostly just refueling small planes and running the weather instruments for pilots flying in late cargo or private flights. That night, it was early October, and the wind had dropped completely, leaving the air calm and a little damp, the kind of cold that sits in your bones when you're standing still too long. I was doing my usual rounds around midnight, walking the perimeter with my flashlight, checking the runway lights and the windsock and making sure nothing had wandered onto the tarmac. The sky was clear, stars sharp and bright, and the runway lights stretched out like a string of pearls. I remember noticing how quiet it was, even for the airfield. No planes, no engines, no distant city hum, just the occasional rustle of leaves from the small grove near the southern fence. I had just finished checking the north end when I saw it. At first, I thought it was another plane coming in too fast, but the lights didn't make sense. There was this faint, diffuse glow hovering just beyond the end of the runway lights, maybe 100 feet above the grass. It wasn't moving toward me or away. It wasn't moving at all. I froze for a second, thinking I'd imagined it. My brain tried to rationalize it, some kind of maintenance drone, a weather balloon reflecting runway lights, even a plane idling just out of sight. But as I blinked, the glow was still there, perfectly still and solid. Not flickering like a light bulb, not moving like a drone, just there. I pulled out my radio to call the office, trying to keep my voice steady. Control, this is Mike at the South Tarmac. You seeing anything on your end? There was only static. My stomach sank a little. Usually I'd hear someone even if they were half asleep. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. It wasn't like a plane at all. There were no visible wings, no tail, no landing gear, nothing that should have been holding it in the air. It was just a dark, solid shape outlined against the faint lights of the runway, bigger than any plane I'd worked with there, and silent. Absolutely silent. I raised my binoculars, expecting to see a helicopter or some sort of experimental aircraft. Nothing. The shape was almost featureless, just this looming presence sitting in the air, perfectly still. My first thought was that maybe it was a reflection off the clouds, but there weren't any clouds. The sky was clear, the stars visible, and the runway lights weren't reflecting anywhere near that height. I blinked again, looked down for half a second to jot a note in my logbook, and when I looked back, the shape was gone. Totally gone. No glow, no outline, nothing. I swore aloud, expecting it to maybe reappear. I shined my flashlight toward the end of the runway. Nothing. I went back to the control panel to check the instruments. The radar there is nothing high-tech, but it picks up anything above the runway that's sizable enough, and the screen was showing a blip, a large stationary object hovering just where I had seen the shape. It wasn't moving at all, but the instruments were registering it like it existed in the airspace, completely solid. I stared at that blip for what felt like a minute, then it vanished too. Not gradually, just disappeared. My heart was racing at that point, and I kept muttering to myself, trying to rationalize it. Maybe some kind of interference, a glitch in the radar. I double-checked all the instruments. Nothing. Everything else looked normal. I decided to walk the runway end again, just to be sure. My flashlight beam cut through the damp air, and I scanned every shadow, every grove of trees along the perimeter. No movement, no glow, nothing. I even climbed the small control tower to get a better vantage point. From up there, the airfield looked normal, perfectly ordinary, but there was that strange feeling in the pit of my stomach, like the place had shifted just for a few moments. I called my supervisor on his cell, careful to keep my voice calm. "Hey, Bill, you ever seen a hovering object over the runway? No sound, just stationary?" There was a long pause. He laughed nervously. "Mike, it's a private airfield. Nothing flies around here at night except small planes and maybe a drone someone's messing with. You okay?" I didn't press it. He didn't sound worried, but I could tell he thought I was seeing things. The rest of the night, I stayed on the tarmac, checking the lights, scanning the sky, but nothing else appeared. Every now and then, I'd catch a trick of the light or a shadow that made me think I saw it again, but it was gone the instant I focused. By morning, when the first planes came in, everything seemed normal. The instruments checked out. The runway lights were fine. I kept expecting to see some evidence, scorched grass, tracks, but there was nothing unusual. When I told a few coworkers later, they all laughed it off, joking about Mike's ghost plane or sleep deprivation. But the instruments, the radar, hadn't lied. Something had been there, large and stationary, and now it wasn't. Weeks went by, and I kept thinking about it every night when I drove home from work. I tried explaining it to myself as a drone, a hallucination, a glitch, but nothing fit. The shape, the size, the absolute silence, it didn't match anything I'd seen in my years at small airfields. I still work the night shift. Sometimes, when it's quiet and the lights stretch out across the tarmac, I catch myself scanning the airspace, waiting for that glow to reappear. It hasn't yet, but the feeling remains. That night, the world felt slightly off, like something had been there, real, and left without a trace, leaving me to wonder if I'll ever see it again or if it was never supposed to be seen at all. I woke because the whole room had turned white. For a second, I thought the sun had come up early. My phone said 3:07 a.m., and the bed smelled like cedar and coffee grounds from the night before. But the light pouring through the windows was wrong. Too clean, like someone had slid a sheet of paper over the landscape, and everything beyond it was flat and bright. It hit the cedar floorboards and made the knots in the wood look like black eyes. I sat up, heart thudding, and for a minute, I just listened. There was no wind in the pines, no loons or frogs on the lake, not even the usual whisper of the road far down the hill. The silence was the first thing that told me whatever this was, it wasn't ordinary. I'm Mark. I'd driven up to a little cabin outside Lake Placid to write. "Get away from screens" was the line I'd given my coworkers, and I was supposed to enjoy the quiet. This was different quiet. I pulled on jeans and an old sweatshirt and cracked the back door. The brightness hit me full on, like walking into a lit room from a movie theater. Outside, the yard was bathed in white. The trees didn't cast normal shadows. They were silhouettes with a kind of hard edge. I expected to see something. Maybe a truck with its high beams on, a neighbor with a spotlight doing target practice. But there was nothing. Not a single headlight, not a flash of movement, just the light hanging in the low space above the treetops, making the fog over the lake look painted. It was silent in a way that made me notice my own breathing. There was a taste in the air, metallic and clean, like after a thunderstorm but without the rain. My keys felt heavy in my pocket when I took them out. I walked down the path toward the lake because it felt stupid to stay on the porch and pretend nothing was happening. The boards under my feet were warm from the day, which made the whole scene feel odd, warm wood and bright, cold light. The lake was mirror smooth. The glow was reflected across the water in a broad, washed-out band that didn't move with the slightest ripple. Sometimes lake reflections wobble, especially at night. Boats, wind, insects. But this was a smooth sheet of light that looked like the underside of a cloud. I could not, for the life of me, tell where it began or ended. Out on the dark water, there was no silhouette, no craft, no glow source. If there had been, there would have been wake or light or heat or sound. There was none. My phone read, "No service." I half expected it. Cell reception in that part of the Adirondacks is petty at the best of times. What threw me was that the battery had dropped an impossible amount. It had been at 84% when I'd shut it in the kitchen. Now it was down to 12 and getting warm under my hand. I pocketed it and kept going. I walked the shoreline until my sneakers hit damp sand and then stopped. The woods on the far side were black, but there was this thin band of brightness above them, stationary, like somebody had placed a lamp on a low shelf and left the room. I remember thinking of a theater curtain before a show rises, the way the stage is lit and everything behind it is in shadow. That's what it felt like, a stage with the audience yet to enter. A small sound broke the stillness, the faintest crack of something under tension, like ice very thinly forming, but there was no ice in early September. Then nothing again. The sound made my hackles rise. It was the first weird thing that was actually audible. Not long after, there was a second oddity I'd later replay in my head. The old wind chime hanging by the back stoop started swinging without a breeze, its metal tubes clinking once, twice, in a rhythm that didn't match any wind I'd ever heard on that property. I stood there and watched the aluminum tubes wobble and then stop as if they'd been nudged and put down. I thought about the dogs that sometimes came from the neighbor's kennel, barking at coyotes, barking at cars, and realized they were utterly not barking. No dogs. No coyotes. No trucks down on Route 73. The only sound was the faint mechanical hum I felt more than heard, like a refrigerator compressor a long way off. It was steady and low, and it vibrated the fillings in my teeth a little. I went back to the cabin, checked the porch light, flipped the breaker, nothing. The breaker box was normal, but the porch lamp stayed dark. My hands shook when I opened the tiny kitchen drawer to grab a flashlight. The flashlight itself had a charge, but when I clicked it on the beam, came on weak and blue, like it was filtered through frosted glass. It made the white on the counters look yellow. I walked back outside with the flashlight and scanned the tree line. My breath fogged in front of my face, even though it didn't feel cold. There was a faint shimmer at treetop height on the eastern shore, where the state land cliffs dropped down toward the lake. But whenever I trained the beam that way, it collapsed into ordinary dark. I tried the binoculars and could not find the edge of the light. Looking felt ridiculous, like squinting at the sun through a coffee filter. I told myself it was probably some boring explanation. I asked myself the usual litany. Was it a hangar with training lights on? A helicopter hovering and the rotors muffled by fog? Floodlights from a distant film set? None of those fit. I'd been around enough aviation and film to know the sound and work patterns they make. This was not any of that. I went back inside and did something I've done 100 times. I brewed coffee. The kettle sang in the otherwise quiet place. The sound anchored me. I sat at the little table and watched the steam and felt my pulse slow a bit. The clock on the microwave blinked 00 like an old VCR. It had power but would not set. My watch, a cheap field watch, read 3:08 when I looked at it and then, without moving, ticked forward to 3:32. I could not explain that. I didn't sleep any further. I sat at the window and watched the lake like an idiot. After a while, 10, 20 minutes, I don't know, the brightness thinned at the edges. It was like watching someone zoom a camera out. The center remained bright, but the body of it narrowed and then dissolved into the air. For an instant, the whole space felt like someone had exhaled. The hum eased. The normal night sounds came back slowly, starting with a single distant bark, then crickets, then something heavy rolling in on the road far off. A truck. Morning came flat and ordinary. The sky was pale blue and cold. Birds were noisy as if to make up for the silence of the night. The lobster trap of autumn smell, damp leaves, cedar, river, was waking up. I checked the yard. There was no scorch, no melted grass, no torn branches. The ground where I'd stood by the water was unmarked and damp. The chime by the porch had a slight bend in one tube as if someone had leaned on it, but it was nothing conclusive. I packed up mid-morning. I felt ridiculous and hollow at once. I drove the Jeep to the main road and turned the radio on. For the first 10 minutes, the signal fuzzed like it had been playing through a film projector. Then a local station popped in clean, as an alarm clock. The whole drive home felt like riding a movie that had lost a reel. Parts were sharp color, parts were missing. At the gas station in town, I checked my phone. It synced immediately and showed my messages. 2 from my boss asking if I'd met the client in town. 1 from a friend saying, "You see the lights?" I stared at it and typed back, "I saw something. Weird." Couldn't explain it. He sent a thumb up emoji, and my cousin saw it over Mirror Lake. Lights bright as day. Everyone's talking. I cleaned the mud off my boots when I got to the driveway. Erin was in the kitchen making sandwich dough and asked if I'd had a good trip. I told her the truth. It was quiet in a way I didn't like, and she nodded without really hearing. I didn't push it. Telling people changes things. I wanted to hold the feeling for a little longer, like something fragile. The thing about that night wasn't just the light. It was the silence that came with it. The way the world seemed to stop paying attention to itself for a little while. It felt less like a spectacle and more like an inspection. Someone or something came through the space, glanced at the surface, and moved on. I don't know what it meant. I know only that I woke to a white that didn't belong at 3 a.m., that the woods were unnatural in how they listened, and that when I left the place behind, the ordinary noise of people and engines and small appliances felt like a relief. Weeks later, I still check the window some nights. Sometimes the dark seems thinner, like paper you could slide a finger through. Mostly, I go about my days. The manuscript got another paragraph or 2. My boss asked if I'd like another week away, and I said no. There are things you can explain and things you can't. I drove out for the silence and returned with a bright shape burned into the back of my skull. A thing that sits where a neat answer should be and refuses to move. It was a little after 2 in the morning when I gave up on trying to sleep. It was one of those humid summer nights in Brooklyn where the air inside your apartment feels like someone's breathing right next to your face. I'd already flipped my pillow twice, drank water, turned the fan up, but nothing helped. So I got up, slipped on some shorts, and went out onto the fire escape to get some air. I live in Clinton Hill, 3rd floor of a brownstone that's been split into apartments. The building's old but sturdy, and the roof's accessible through a small door in the hallway. Usually no one goes up there except when the landlord's checking the vents, but I like to sneak up sometimes when I can't sleep. It's quiet, and you can see a good chunk of the skyline. That night, the city was muffled. You could still hear the faint hum of traffic on the BQE, but it wasn't loud. The air smelled like hot concrete and someone's leftover takeout from another window. The sky was this dull, grayish purple, the kind you get from light pollution mixing with humidity. No stars, just that glow. I sat on the low wall by the edge, facing toward Manhattan. The Empire State Building was lit up blue and white, cutting through the haze. I stayed there for a while, just zoning out. Then I noticed it. There was a single white light high above the skyline. At first, I thought it was a plane heading toward LaGuardia, but it wasn't moving. Not at all. It hung there, tiny but sharp, pure white, no blinking, no color change. I figured maybe it was a drone, though it seemed too high for that. Way higher than any drone I'd seen around here. I watched it for a minute, waiting for it to shift. Nothing. It didn't even seem to drift like stars do over time. Just perfectly still. After a while, I realized how quiet everything had gotten. I hadn't noticed before, but the usual night sounds, sirens in the distance, music from someone's car, the occasional shout, were gone. Even the crickets that sometimes chirped in the courtyard had gone silent. It felt like the air had thickened. I kept staring at that light. 5 minutes passed, maybe more. My brain started going through the usual explanations: plane holding pattern, maybe a helicopter hovering, though there were no red or green side lights. And if it was a chopper, I should have heard it. Then out of nowhere, the light flickered. Not like it blinked off, but like it wavered, stretched slightly, then snapped back into place. I leaned forward, trying to focus. A second later, it moved. It didn't rise or fall. It shot sideways, fast, not gradually accelerating, just instantly moving left across the sky like a ruler sliding across a desk. It covered what looked like miles of sky in less than a second, then stopped dead. No arc, no sound, no trail. I remember my breath catching in my throat. The movement was so clean, it didn't even look real, like an animation glitch. It stayed there, in its new spot, just hanging again. I counted to 10, eyes locked on it, and it didn't budge. Then it darted again, back the other direction, even farther this time, and froze again. I said out loud, "What the fuck?" There was no one to hear me. For a few seconds, I thought maybe it was my eyes, like I'd moved my head slightly and it created the illusion of movement. So I tested it. I fixed my line of sight on the edge of a rooftop antenna and compared the light's position. It wasn't me. It was really moving. The air felt heavier then, like it does before a storm. But the clouds hadn't changed. No wind, no rumble of thunder. Just this weight pressing down and that light hanging there like it was aware of me. It stayed in that last position for maybe another minute, maybe two. I lost track of time because I couldn't look away. My heartbeat was loud enough that it filled my ears. Then, just when I started to think it was over, it made one last movement. It shot straight up. Not gradually, not at an angle, straight up, vertical. It accelerated so fast that the light became a streak, then vanished into the haze. No fade out, no dimming. Gone, like someone had turned off a switch. The moment it disappeared, the sounds of the city came back all at once. I heard a siren somewhere near Myrtle, a car horn, faint music from an open window. Even the air changed. It felt lighter, easier to breathe. I stayed sitting there for a while, just staring at the empty patch of sky where it had been. Nothing else moved up there. I half expected another light to appear, but it didn't. Eventually, I went back inside. I didn't even bother checking my phone or trying to film it. I hadn't thought to while it was happening. My hands were shaking a little. I got into bed, but I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that light snapping sideways. The next morning, I told my neighbor, Luis, about it. He laughed at first, thought I was joking, then said he'd seen weird lights once over Red Hook that looked like that. Fast and silent, but he figured they were experimental drones. That made sense on paper, but this thing had been higher than any drone could fly without losing signal. I tried looking up flight paths from LaGuardia and JFK later that day. Nothing matched what I saw. No aircraft in that position at that time. A couple nights later, around the same hour, I went back up to the roof. The air was cooler that night, a little breezy. The sky was clear enough that I could see a few faint stars. I stood there scanning the same patch of sky just in case. Nothing. But after about 15 minutes, I noticed something else. This faint buzzing sound, like an electrical hum, coming from somewhere above me. Not loud, but constant. I looked around for the source, but there were no transformers nearby, no air conditioners running. The sound seemed to be coming from the sky itself. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. The next morning, my phone's compass app wouldn't work. I tried recalibrating it, but it just spun slowly, never settling. It stayed that way for most of the day, then fixed itself the following evening. I didn't connect those things at first, but they stuck in my mind. The silence, the hum, the compass glitch, all small, but strange enough to feel related somehow. A week went by, and I figured I'd let it go. Then one night, I was watching TV around 11, and the screen flickered for half a second. Just static, like an old VHS rewind. At the same time, I heard a single short tone like feedback from my speaker. When I glanced at the window, there was a faint white glow reflected in the glass. I thought maybe it was a plane again, but when I looked outside, the sky was empty. It wasn't as dramatic as the first night, but it left me with that same heavy feeling in my chest, like whatever that thing had been wasn't far away. Since then, I haven't gone up to the roof after midnight. I still think about that light sometimes when I see planes overhead, how steady they move, how normal their blinking looks. I start to imagine what it would look like if one of them suddenly darted sideways the way that light did. I've told a few people, but no one really knows what to say. It's easier to just file it under weird New York stuff and move on. But sometimes when the nights are quiet enough, I'll stand at my window and stare up at that same patch of sky, half expecting it to be there again. Perfectly still, perfectly silent, waiting. It was around 1:30 in the morning when I crossed the Tappan Zee Bridge. I'd been driving back from a client dinner in White Plains to my place in Kingston. Normally I take the Taconic, but that night I wanted an easier route. Less wildlife, fewer sharp turns in the dark. It was late and I was tired in that way, where your body feels heavy but your mind's still wired from caffeine. The highway was basically empty by then. It had rained earlier that night, so the pavement still had that damp shine. The air looked hazy over the river, mist or low fog, hard to tell. The lights along the bridge reflected in the wet asphalt like smeared gold paint. I had the radio on low, some late-night AM station playing talk segments about stock futures. Everything about the drive felt quiet and mechanical, almost peaceful. Somewhere near the middle of the bridge, I noticed something off about the sky. It wasn't a flash or light or anything, it was the absence of it. Above the water to my right, maybe 100 yards out, there was this shape. Huge, dark, and low. My first thought was a cloud bank, but it wasn't moving like one. It was more defined, more solid. At first, I didn't pay it much attention. You get weird light tricks over the river at night, fog, reflection, that sort of thing. But as I got closer, I realized how big it was. Whatever it was sitting just above the waterline, probably a few 100 feet wide. There weren't any lights on it, and yet it blocked the glow from the bridge lamps, like a hole punched into the air itself. I slowed down without realizing it, easing off the gas until I was barely doing 40. The bridge was completely empty, no cars in front or behind me, just me, the hum of tires on wet concrete and that black shape off to the right. I rolled down my window, like half expecting to hear a helicopter or a boat engine. Nothing. The air rushing in was cold and damp, but completely silent otherwise. Even the usual wind noise over the bridge seemed muted. Then my radio crackled. It wasn't just static. It was like the signal was being pulled apart. Voices stretched and warped, bits of sound rising and falling in weird, uneven bursts. I reached for the dial, thinking maybe I'd hit a dead zone, but when I turned it off, the static didn't stop. It just kept hissing softly from the speakers. I turned it back on. The talk station was gone, just a faint, pulsing whine mixed with white noise. When I looked back toward the river, the shape had shifted. I swear it had moved closer to the bridge. It wasn't fast or dramatic, just repositioned. Still no lights, no outline I could fully make out. The best way I can describe it is like a patch of darker darkness, hovering low and steady over the water. The weird part was how my headlights hit the mist in front of me. Everything else reflected a little, caught some light. But the space where that thing was didn't reflect anything at all. It just absorbed the dark. I thought about pulling over, but there's no shoulder on that part of the span, just the narrow maintenance lane. So I kept driving, gripping the wheel tighter than I probably needed to. The static in the car got louder, like the sound of an old TV turned up just a little too high. Then my dashboard lights flickered. The speedometer needle dropped to 0 for a split second and jumped back up. The check engine light blinked on, then off. My heart started pounding. I remember saying out loud, "Come on, don't do this now." I glanced at the river again. The shape was still there, but now it looked higher. Maybe 50 feet above the water, drifting slowly, perfectly parallel to the bridge. I couldn't tell how far it extended in either direction. It felt massive, but my eyes couldn't fix on its edges. Every time I tried to focus, it looked like it was blending into the air, like heat shimmer. About halfway across, I noticed something else. The street lamps on the bridge ahead of me were dimming one by one. Not going completely dark, but fading slightly, like their power was being drawn down. The ones behind me looked normal. The ones ahead looked dull, washed out. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the radio static cut out. Just silence. I turned the knob, nothing. The dash lights steadied. Everything looked normal again. I glanced toward the river. The shape was gone, not faded or distant, just gone. I kept looking, scanning the waterline, the far bank, the sky. Nothing. Only the mist and the reflection of the bridge lights rippling in the black water. I drove the rest of the way across, trying to convince myself it was fog or shadows or something I misread because I was tired. But the air in the car felt weirdly charged, like static on your skin before lightning hits. Once I reached the toll plaza, I slowed down again. There were no attendants at that hour, just the automated gates. I half expected the machine not to register my Easy Pass, but it worked fine. As soon as I hit solid ground again, the radio came back to life on its own. Same station, same host's voice mid-sentence, like nothing had happened. The sound quality, though, was off. I can't explain it exactly, but his voice sounded flat, like it was being played through a layer of cotton. I switched stations, then switched back. Same effect. About 10 minutes later, when I was on 9W heading north, I saw a glow in my rearview mirror. It wasn't headlights, it was above the road, faint and bluish, like a reflection on my windshield that shouldn't have been there. I turned off the radio again and rolled down the window. The glow didn't fade or move with the car. It just hung there behind me, steady and silent, until the road curved into the trees and I lost sight of the river. The drive from there was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the tension. Every time I passed under a streetlight, I'd glance at the shadows, half expecting something to be hovering above the treetops. My phone screen had this slight flicker whenever I tried to check the time, like interference. When I finally got home, it was close to 3 a.m. The house was dark except for the porch light I'd left on. I sat in the driveway with the engine idling for a minute, trying to decide if I should tell anyone about what I'd seen. I turned the radio back on one last time, perfectly clear. Perfect clear. No static, no distortion. I shut off the car and just listened. Crickets, distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere down the block, completely normal night sounds. The next morning, I walked out to the car to grab my jacket. When I opened the door, there was this faint smell inside, ozone, like the air after a thunderstorm. My dashboard clock was blinking 12, like the power had been cut at some point. The car battery was fine though, started right up. I didn't tell anyone at work. Didn't mention it to my wife either, not right away. It felt too strange to explain without sounding crazy. 2 days later, driving home in broad daylight, I noticed a fine layer of something on my windshield, like dust or pollen, but it shimmered faintly when the sunlight hit it. When I wiped it with my sleeve, it smeared, leaving streaks that caught the light in a dull, metallic way. It could have been anything, salt from the road, residue from rain, whatever. But I couldn't shake the thought of that dark shape hovering over the Hudson, silent and massive and wrong. I've crossed the Tappan Zee plenty of times since then. I always check the water, just out of habit. I've never seen anything like that again. But sometimes when I'm halfway across and the fog starts rolling in, my radio still cuts out for a few seconds. And every time it does, I can't help but glance to the right toward the river, just to make sure there's nothing there. It started on a Friday afternoon in late August. My wife Lauren and I had taken our 2 kids, Evan, who's 8, and Mia, who's 5, on a weekend camping trip up in the Catskills. We weren't hardcore campers or anything. We had a decent tent, an old cooler full of sandwiches and sodas, and a small propane stove. Mostly, we just wanted to get the kids away from screens for a couple days and breathe some mountain air. We got to the campsite around 5 in the evening. It was one of those small, semi-private spots off a dirt loop road near Woodland Valley, surrounded by thick trees, but with a clearing big enough for a tent and a fire pit. There were a few other families scattered around the loop, but far enough that we couldn't really see or hear them. It was humid, a little hazy, and the air smelled like pine needles and wet earth. By the time we finished setting up the tent, the sky was already starting to dim, that kind of heavy dusk light where everything turns gray-blue. We made hot dogs over the fire and roasted marshmallows, and for a while it was perfect. Kids sticky with sugar, fire popping, crickets starting up. Around 9, Lauren took the kids into the tent to get them ready for bed. I stayed by the fire a while longer, just enjoying the quiet. The smoke was drifting straight up, barely moving, which meant the air was still. I remember that because it made the night feel weirdly heavy. When I leaned back in my folding chair and looked up through the gaps in the trees, the sky was darker than I expected. No moon that night, just a few scattered stars through the haze. That's when I noticed the lights. At first, I thought it was a plane. 3 white lights, faint but clear, moving above the tree line. They were spaced evenly, like they could have been the lights on the wings and nose of a small aircraft. But what threw me off was how they moved, slow and perfectly smooth. No blinking, no sound, just sliding through the sky in a straight line. I watched them for maybe a minute before calling softly toward the tent. "Hey, Lore, come check this out." She came out with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, sleepy-eyed but curious. The kids followed, crawling halfway out of the tent. "What is it?" she asked. I pointed up. That. We all just stood there watching. The 3 lights were gliding above the trees, completely silent, holding that same triangular formation. The weird part was how steady it was. No wobble, no change in brightness, no sound of engines, just smooth. Evan said, "It looks like a big triangle," which was exactly what it looked like, 3 points forming a shape against the stars. Then, without warning, all 3 lights blinked out at the same time. Just gone. We all gasped, thinking maybe it had gone behind a cloud. But there weren't any visible clouds, and the stars were still clear. A few seconds passed, 5 maybe, and then the lights blinked back on. Only now they weren't where they'd been. They were directly overhead. I mean, straight above us, still in that perfect triangle, perfectly still. Not moving this time, just hanging there. Lauren whispered, "What the hell?" I remember the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. The air felt thick, almost pressurized, like before a thunderstorm. But it wasn't windy, and it wasn't hot or cold. It just felt different. The lights were brighter now. Still white, but there was a faint bluish edge to them, like LEDs. They didn't cast light downward, though. The ground around us stayed dark. I thought about grabbing my phone to film it, but the idea felt stupidly wrong. I didn't want to move. None of us did. Mia asked if it was a helicopter. I said maybe, even though I knew it wasn't. I couldn't hear a thing. Not a rotor, not a hum. Just the crackle of the fire. Then the lights started to move again, only this time, instead of drifting, they rotated. Slowly, like they were pivoting around a single invisible point in the middle of the triangle. It made no sense. Planes can't do that. Drones, maybe, but that high, that steady? Lauren grabbed my arm. "It's gotta be military," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. They kept rotating until one light was directly above the others, forming almost a vertical line. Then they stopped again. Dead still. Evan said, "Dad, they're looking at us." That hit me harder than it should have. He said it like it was obvious, like he could feel something watching him. I told him it was fine, that they were just lights, but I couldn't shake that same feeling, like being under a spotlight you couldn't see. A moment later, the lights started to pulse. Not flashing, more like they were breathing. Each one brightened, dimmed, then brightened again, all in perfect sync. Slow, rhythmic. It wasn't random, it felt timed. Then everything went quiet. The crickets, the frogs, even the breeze in the trees, gone. Total silence. I didn't even realize how much background noise there had been until it stopped. I could hear the blood in my head and that faint electric hum you get in dead, quiet places. The lights pulsed a few more times, then, again, all at once, they vanished. We just stood there staring at empty sky. No fading out, no drift, just off. Lauren whispered, "Let's go inside." So we did. I zipped the tent closed and lay there wide awake while the kids fell asleep fast, still chattering about the triangle. Lauren and I didn't say much. We could still feel it somehow, like the night was waiting for something else to happen. At some point, I must have dozed off because when I woke up it was freezing. My phone said 3:12 a.m. The fire was out. Everything was dark except for this faint glow outside the tent. It wasn't bright enough to be a flashlight, more like moonlight through fog. But the air felt wrong again, that same heavy, still pressure. I sat up and unzipped the tent just a little. The glow was coming from the trees beyond our campsite. Not a campfire, not headlights. It was diffused, bluish white, and it seemed to shift like it was moving through the trees. I thought maybe someone from another site was walking with a lantern, but it wasn't bouncing or swinging. It was steady. And the weirdest part, it didn't light up the trees around it. It was just in the air, floating there, dim but visible. I closed the zipper again and lay back down, every nerve on edge. Lauren was awake too. She whispered, "You see it?" And I nodded. The light stayed there for a while, 5 minutes maybe, and then faded away. Not gone in an instant, just thinned out until there was nothing. We didn't sleep much after that. The next morning was normal again. Birds were back, sunlight through the trees, kids complaining about oatmeal. I almost convinced myself we'd imagined most of it. But when I went to get water from the spigot, I noticed something odd near the edge of our campsite. 3 small circles burned into the ground. Perfect circles, maybe 6 inches wide each, arranged in a triangle. I called Lauren over. She saw them too. The grass inside each ring was yellowed and dry, like it had been hit with heat. We couldn't figure out what could have made them. No fire had spread there, and nothing had been set down in that shape. We left that afternoon instead of staying another night. The kids didn't argue. Driving down the mountain road, I kept checking the sky. I didn't see anything unusual, but every time I glanced out the window, it felt like the air shimmered. Just for a second, like heat off asphalt, even though it was cool and cloudy. We haven't been back to that campground since. But sometimes on clear nights at home, when the stars are out and the air's still, I catch myself looking up, half expecting to see those 3 white lights sliding silently above the trees again. We got up there late Friday afternoon. The drive from Albany to Lake George took longer than usual because of some road work on I-87, and by the time we pulled into the small campground near the southern edge of the lake, the light was starting to fade. It was me and my friend Travis. We'd been trying to plan a weekend fishing trip for months, and this was finally the one that lined up with both our schedules. The weather was perfect for it. Cool for early September, with that crisp edge in the air you only get in the mountains. No wind at all, barely a ripple on the lake. The surface looked like glass when we got out of the truck. You could see the tree line reflected so clearly, it almost messed with your depth perception. We pitched the tent, cracked a couple beers, and decided we'd get the boat out early in the morning. It wasn't much of a boat, just a 12-foot aluminum rowboat I'd borrowed from my uncle, but it was enough for a calm lake like that. That night we cooked over the little fire pit, mostly just talking about work and family stuff. Travis is one of those people who's always got a story ready, usually about something stupid he or one of his coworkers did. It was comfortable, easy conversation until around 10 when the air suddenly got colder. It wasn't gradual either. One minute we were sitting there sweating a little from the fire, the next I could see my breath. We both noticed it. Travis said, "That's weird," and poked at the fire, thinking maybe it was just dying down, but it wasn't. The wood was still burning steady. The cold wasn't from the wind either, because there wasn't any. The trees were dead still, and the surface of the lake was perfectly flat. It didn't last long, maybe a minute, and then it was back to normal, warm again. I didn't think much of it after that. Mountain air can be strange sometimes. The next morning, we were out on the water just after sunrise. A light mist hung low across the surface, curling around the oars as I rowed us out. The silence was thick. No other boats, no birds yet, just the occasional drip from the oars and the sound of metal scraping against the wood of the oarlocks. We anchored maybe 100 yards from the far shore, a little cove that looked good for trout. The mist started to thin as the sun came up, and for a while it was just peaceful. I remember thinking I could sit there all day, even if we didn't catch anything. Around 8, I noticed the water shift. Not the usual ripple from a breeze or a fish jumping. This was different. It was like a single point on the surface started to tremble, sending perfect circular ripples outward. The kind you get when you drop a pebble, except there hadn't been any splash, no noise. "Did you see that?" I said. Travis turned his head and nodded. "Yeah. Must be something right under us." He leaned over the side, squinting into the water. It was still early enough that the sunlight hit at an angle, so you couldn't see far down, just a murky reflection of the trees. I expected to see bubbles or movement, but the water was clear and still again. Then it happened a second time, a few feet to the left. Another perfect ring of ripples, spreading wide, then fading out. Maybe a turtle, I said, though I didn't really believe it. We both watched for a while, but nothing else moved. After a few minutes, we went back to fishing. Around mid-morning, the wind died completely. The lake turned back into that mirror-flat surface again, the kind of stillness that feels too quiet. Even the distant hum of cars from the highway was gone. That's when Travis pointed. Look, right there. About 20 yards off the bow, another ripple started, but this time there was light coming from underneath it. At first, I thought it was sunlight bouncing off something, like a piece of metal under the surface, but it didn't shift or glint. It just glowed. A soft white-green light diffused through the water, maybe 10 feet down. It was roughly circular, about the size of a dining table, pulsing gently, almost like it was breathing. We didn't say anything for a few seconds, just stared. Then Travis whispered, "What is that?" I said, "I don't know," and instinctively grabbed the side of the boat to steady myself. The glow brightened slightly, enough that I could see Travis's face reflected pale green. The ripples started again, concentric circles rolling out from the light, smooth and even, never breaking. We sat frozen, waiting for something to surface, a fish, a diver, anything. But the glow stayed steady, not moving closer or farther. It just sat there beneath the water, humming faintly. I could almost feel the vibration through the hull. Then, without warning, it dimmed. Not like a light being turned off, but like it sank deeper, fading until it was gone. The ripples stopped. The lake went perfectly flat again. I remember the sound that followed, or more like the absence of it. Total silence. Not even the small noises you don't realize you hear until they're gone. Wind, birds, insects, distant traffic. Nothing. Travis finally said, "Let's head in." His voice sounded off, like it was being swallowed by the air. I nodded and started rowing back. The oars made almost no splash. Each stroke felt too loud in the quiet. About halfway to shore, the cold hit again, sharp and sudden like stepping into a walk-in freezer. I looked down and saw condensation forming on the metal parts of the boat. When I exhaled, my breath came out white. The cold lasted longer this time, maybe 3 or 4 minutes, then it lifted, just as fast as it came. When we reached shore, we both got out without saying much. I pulled the boat up and turned around to look at the lake. Completely still, smooth as glass again. The reflection of the trees was perfect. Too perfect. There were no ripples, no hint of movement, not even where we just rode in. The water looked untouched. We stood there for a while, watching. I thought maybe we'd see the glow again, or at least some disturbance, but it stayed calm. The mist that had burned off earlier started to creep back across the surface, thick and low. Travis said quietly, "You feel that?" I did. The air was humming again, not loud, not something you could hear exactly, but you could feel it, like a low frequency in your chest. We packed up soon after. Neither of us wanted to stay another night. The campground manager asked if everything was okay when we checked out early, and Travis just said, "Weather's turning," even though it wasn't. The drive back was quiet. About halfway down the interstate, I realized my phone had no signal. It didn't come back until we were near Saratoga, then suddenly the bars popped up full. I looked over at Travis's phone on the dash. It was dead, even though it had been fully charged that morning. When I plugged mine into the car charger, the clock on the screen blinked wrong. It said 4:27 p.m., but it was barely noon. We both checked our watches. They were fine. Just the phone's time, completely off. That night after I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about how still the water had been after that light disappeared. It was like the lake had reset itself. No sign we'd ever been out there. I went online and tried to find any reports of underwater lights or gas releases or anything that could cause ripples like that, but nothing matched what we saw. A couple days later, Travis texted me a photo he'd taken before the light appeared. Just a normal shot of the lake at dawn. But when I looked closer, near the bottom corner of the frame, there was a faint blur. Circular, pale green. He swore it hadn't been there when he took it. We haven't gone fishing together since. I still have that picture saved, though. And every once in a while, when I look at it, I notice something else in the reflection of the trees. Tiny ripples spreading outward, perfectly even, like the surface of the lake was already moving long before we realized it. I was running the loop around the reservoir in Central Park like I did most nights after work. It was early spring, just warm enough that you could run in a long sleeve without freezing. The air still had that wet, cold smell of winter. I remember it was a Thursday because the park was emptier than usual. Not totally empty, but quiet enough that my footsteps echoed a little on the pavement. I usually start at 90th and run counterclockwise, but that night I went the other way for no reason at all. Around halfway through, near the east side of the water, I stopped to catch my breath. The sky was clear, the city lights behind me soft and yellow, and the surface of the reservoir was smooth, like glass. You could see the reflections of the skyline, the running path lights, even a plane way up high, blinking slowly across the dark. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the center of the water, the reflections started to ripple, not from wind or ducks or anything moving on the surface, but from underneath. It was subtle at first, just a shimmer that moved against the direction of the small waves. I thought maybe it was a fish or some debris catching the light, but it spread outward, forming these slow-moving rings that didn't look right. The weird part was that it wasn't random. The ripples pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. I turned to look up at the sky, thinking maybe a helicopter was passing overhead. Nothing. Just stars and the faint trail of an airplane way off to the south. When I looked back down, the light on the water had changed. There were 3 pale streaks reflected on the surface, like beams from something moving across the sky, except there was nothing above to make them. The beams weren't white exactly, more like silver or cold blue, and they moved together in perfect sync, sliding slowly across the reflection of the skyline. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. I even took out my phone, but the reflection barely showed up on the screen. It just looked like glare from the path lights. A man ran past me and I almost stopped him to ask if he saw it too, but I didn't. I felt stupid, like maybe it was some weird visual thing from the water or my eyes adjusting to the dark. Then the lights started to move differently. They spread apart, widening into a triangle shape, perfectly even, then began to rotate. The reflections rippled with them, distorting the skyline behind it. For a second, I thought maybe there were drones flying somewhere behind me, but I turned around and saw only the dark line of trees and the faint glow of the city beyond. No sound, no movement, nothing. When I turned back, the triangle had stopped spinning. It just hovered there in the reflection, dead still. The air felt heavier, like when a storm is about to break. I remember realizing the park had gone completely silent. No rustling leaves, no footsteps, no distant sirens. It was the quietest I'd ever heard the city. And then, without warning, the lights in the reflection started to ripple again, faster this time, until the water looked like it was boiling with light. The whole thing lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then the reflections blinked out, just gone. The water went perfectly still again. That's when I noticed the path lights flicker. It was subtle, like the power dipped for half a second. The nearest lamp dimmed and buzzed. The runner who had passed me earlier was now a dark shape far down the trail, but I saw him glance back, like he noticed it too. I decided that was enough for me. I started jogging again, faster than before, trying not to look at the water. But about 50 yards ahead, the lights flickered again. All of them, one by one, down the curve of the path, almost like something was moving along with me. When I stopped, the flickering stopped too. I was breathing hard now, not from running, but from that slow panic that creeps up when something doesn't make sense. The reservoir was calm again, smooth and mirror-like. I forced myself to look down at the water one last time. Nothing. Except there was a faint shimmer, like heat haze, rippling just beneath the surface where the triangle had been reflected. It was faint enough that I thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks. But when I blinked, it was still there. Moving slightly, almost like something deep beneath was giving off light through the water. I took out my phone again and hit record, panning slowly over the surface. The screen showed nothing unusual, just the skyline, the reflections, the dark water. But when I reviewed it later at home, there was a single frame where something bright flared across the middle of the water, like lightning under glass. It was there for less than a second. Anyway, that night, I left the park early. I cut across to Fifth Avenue and walked the rest of the way home. Every car that passed felt too bright, too loud. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, but when I checked, there were no new messages. That might have been the end of it, except for what happened the next morning. I woke up to sunlight streaming in through the blinds, and for a minute I thought maybe I'd dreamed the whole thing. But when I picked up my phone, it was off. Not dead, just off. I hadn't turned it off, and the battery was at 74%. When I powered it back on, the clock was wrong. It showed 6:19 a.m., but my watch and microwave both said 8:12. My phone resynced after a few seconds, but still, that had never happened before. Later that day, I went for another run, partly to prove to myself that it was nothing weird. Same time, same route. The park looked completely normal. People walking dogs, couples taking photos, a few other joggers on the path. But when I reached the same spot on the east side, I noticed the air felt colder, even though the sun was still up. I stopped again and looked out over the water. Everything looked fine until I realized the reflections were slightly off. The skyline looked distorted, like the buildings were bending inward at the edges. It wasn't much, just enough that it didn't line up with the real thing. I blinked a few times and it straightened out. Maybe it was wind, maybe not. When I got home that evening, I opened the video I'd taken again, frame by frame. The moment that bright flare appeared, there was also a faint sound in the background. A short, low-frequency hum that didn't match anything else in the recording. It only lasted half a second, but it was there. I tried to show it to my coworker, Sam, the next day. We were sitting outside on our lunch break. When I pulled up the video, that one bright frame wasn't there anymore. The whole clip looked normal. He laughed and said, "I probably filmed the glare and messed with the contrast without realizing." I didn't argue. I went back to running at the gym after that. I didn't go near the reservoir again for a while. But a few weeks later, walking home one evening, I cut through the park just to save time. It was cloudy and kind of misty, the kind of night where all the city lights reflect back down from the low clouds. I passed near the reservoir fence and saw movement out of the corner of my eye, just faint ripples spreading out in the water, even though there was no wind. I told myself it was a duck or something, kept walking, didn't stop, but when I reached the end of the fence, I looked back once more. There was a pale glow near the center of the reservoir, faint and steady, like a single reflection from something above. But the sky was solid gray. No moon, no stars, no planes. I stood there maybe 5 seconds, then turned and kept walking until I was out of the park. That was months ago. I haven't seen it since. But every time I pass that stretch of the reservoir, I slow down a little without meaning to, and I catch myself watching the water, just to see if the reflections line up the way they should. We started the hike later than we should have. There were 4 of us, me, Aaron, his girlfriend Lindsay, and my cousin Brian. We were camping for the weekend near the Niagara Gorge, a few miles north of Lewiston on the New York side. It was early September, still warm during the day, but cold enough at night that your breath fogged a little. We'd spent the evening down by the river drinking and talking. Aaron had this idea to hike partway up the gorge trail after dark, just to see what it's like. He said the moon would be bright enough to light the path. It sounded stupid, but we were all a few beers in and restless, so we went along. By the time we started walking, it was past 11. The air had that wet, earthy smell that comes off the river at night. Crickets were loud, and the occasional gust of wind would rattle the trees hard enough to make it sound like footsteps. We had 2 flashlights between us, one of those dim headlamps strapped to Aaron's forehead, and a big mag light I'd brought from the truck. The first part of the trail was fine. You could see the river through the trees every now and then, just a black stretch of moving water catching bits of moonlight. The drop-off on the left side made me nervous. The path was narrow, and loose gravel kept slipping under our boots. Around midnight, we stopped to rest at a small clearing that overlooked part of the gorge. The view was incredible, just this wide, dark canyon with the faint shimmer of the river down below. The sound of rushing water echoed up from somewhere deep in the gorge. It was peaceful, until Lindsay said, "What's that?" She was pointing down toward the bottom of the gorge. At first, I didn't see anything, but then Aaron killed his headlamp and the faint glow became obvious. It was orange, like a campfire, but dimmer, more spread out. It wasn't flickering the way fire should. It just glowed steadily, kind of pulsing every few seconds. None of us said anything for a bit. We just stared. It looked far away, but the scale was hard to tell in the dark. My first thought was that maybe someone had set up a camp down there, though I'd never seen anyone camp at the base before. It's steep and hard to reach. Brian said it didn't look like firelight at all. He was right. The glow wasn't reflecting off anything, not the trees or the rocks. It seemed like it was coming from the ground itself. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes watching it. Every so often it would fade, then brighten again, never going out completely. Aaron suggested hiking down a bit to see it better, but the trail narrowed fast and we didn't have enough light. Lindsay flat out refused, so we decided to turn back. That's when I noticed something weird. The air had gone totally still. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Even the river sounded quieter, like it was farther away. I didn't say anything, but the silence made my skin prickle. Aaron must have felt it too, because he whispered, "Do you guys feel that?" A moment later, there was this low hum, not loud, but deep, like it was coming from underground. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, then stopped. The glow pulsed brighter right after, then faded again. That was enough for Lindsay. She started walking back toward camp, saying she didn't care what it was, she just wanted to leave. None of us argued. The hike back felt longer. Every sound we made, boots on gravel, branches snapping, seemed too sharp against the silence. About halfway up, Brian said his phone had lost signal, which was weird because we'd had full bars before. I checked mine. Same thing. No service. When we finally made it back to camp, the fire had burned down to coals. Nobody said much. We each had a drink, then went to our tents. I lay awake for a long time, listening. I thought I heard the hum again once, but faint and far away. I told myself I imagined it. The next morning, we all agreed to hike back down and check the spot where we'd seen the light. It was around 9 a.m., clear sky, sun already warming the rocks. We followed the same path to the overlook and found the landmark, a big boulder with a dead tree beside it, then started carefully down the slope. The trail near the bottom was muddy and overgrown, but eventually we reached the flat area near the riverbank. It took some guessing to find the exact spot we'd been looking at from above, but when we did, we knew right away. There was a circular patch of scorched ground about 15 feet across. The dirt was dark, almost black, and dry to the touch, even though everything else nearby was damp from dew. The edges of the circle were sharp, like something had burned just that section and nothing else. The trees surrounding it were untouched, no singe marks, no fallen branches. Even the grass a few inches outside the ring was green. Aaron crouched down and poked at the soil with a stick. It broke apart easily like ash, but it didn't smell like anything. No smoke, no charred wood, just dust. "What the hell could do that?" he said. We all kind of stood there, waiting for someone to come up with an answer. Brian guessed maybe lightning, but there were no storms the night before, and there was no sign of an impact point or damage to the nearby trees. I tried to picture a campfire, but the shape was too perfect. No rocks arranged in a circle, no leftover wood or trash. Just that strange burn mark in the dirt. We stayed down there for about 20 minutes. Lindsay wouldn't step inside the circle. She kept saying it made her feel dizzy just looking at it. When we finally left, I took a few photos on my phone. They came out fine on the screen, but later that night, when I looked at them in my camera roll, they were all slightly off. The images were grainy and washed out, like the light exposure was wrong. The rest of my pictures from that weekend looked normal. That afternoon, back at camp, Aaron brought up the hum again. He said when it happened, he felt pressure in his chest, almost like when you're in an airplane and your ears need to pop. Brian said he hadn't felt that, but he'd noticed a faint vibration under his feet right before the sound stopped. I didn't say it at the time, but when we were down there looking at the circle, I'd felt something similar. Not while standing in it, just when I got close to the edge. A kind of static charge, like the air right before a storm. My hair stood up a little. I told myself it was just my nerves. We ended the trip early that day. None of us wanted to spend another night there. On the drive home, Aaron joked about calling someone from the park service to report it, but we never did. A few days later, I checked online for fire reports or anything about lightning strikes near the gorge that night. Nothing came up. I also tried looking up satellite imagery, but of course, the resolution wasn't good enough to see anything that specific. The last odd thing happened about a week afterward. I was sitting on my porch back in Buffalo, scrolling through my phone, when I thought I heard that same low hum again. It wasn't as strong, just a faint vibration like a truck idling far away, but it stopped me cold. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then faded. I walked out to the yard and listened. Everything was quiet again. I haven't heard it since. I don't really talk to the others about it anymore either. We all agreed it was probably something explainable, a geological thing, or some industrial runoff causing weird effects, but I know none of us really believe that. Sometimes, when I can't sleep, I look at those photos on my phone. The burned patch is there, clear as day, but every time I zoom in, it feels like I can see faint color shifts in the soil, tiny streaks of orange, almost like the light's still buried under there, waiting. It was around 11:40 p.m., one of those late-night Staten Island ferry runs where half the people on board are either half asleep or too tired to care about anything. I was heading home from a closing shift at the restaurant, just wanting to zone out for half an hour. The boat was maybe a third full, a few commuters scattered around, some tourists with cameras hanging off their necks even though it was pitch black outside, and a couple of guys in suits looking dead on their feet. It was early March, windy and cold enough that the outer decks were basically empty. I went out there anyway. I liked the quiet, no chatter, no smell of fried food, just the sound of water slapping the hull and the hum of the engines. The city looked small behind us, lights blurring through a faint mist that hadn't turned to rain yet. We were about halfway across, maybe near Governor's Island, when I noticed something off. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, a weird shimmer on the water keeping pace with the ferry. The lights from Manhattan were hitting the harbor in patches, and this shimmer didn't match any of them. It was faint, like a metallic glint that flashed and then disappeared. I leaned over the railing a bit, squinting. Whatever it was moving fast, maybe 50 yards off the starboard side. Every few seconds, it caught some of the ferry's light, just enough to make out a dull, silvery color. Not bright like chrome, more like brushed metal. It skimmed the surface, cutting through the black water so cleanly there was no splash, no wake. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds before I started thinking it might just be debris, a piece of metal drifting or something. But it wasn't drifting. It was matching our speed perfectly, gliding in a straight line parallel to the ferry. I turned to see if anyone else was noticing. There was a guy a few yards down, maybe in his late 40s, with a messenger bag slung over his shoulder. He was looking down at the water too, his head tilted the same way mine was. I said, "Hey, you see that?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Yeah," in this slow, unsure voice, like he was still deciding what he was seeing. We both leaned a little closer. The thing kept pace with us for another 30 seconds, maybe more. The longer I looked, the more I realized it wasn't shaped like a boat or a log or anything I could place. It was rounded, like a flattened dome, maybe 8 or 10 feet across. There were no markings, no lights of its own, just that faint reflection from ours. Then, without warning, it angled down and sank. Not like it tipped or rolled or drifted under. It just moved straight down, perfectly vertical, and vanished. The water didn't react at all. No ripple, no splash. The surface looked untouched. The guy beside me exhaled sharply and muttered, "What the hell was that?" I said, "You saw that, right?" He shook his head. Yeah, I saw it." We stood there another minute, watching the spot where it disappeared. The ferry's wake rolled past, gentle and normal. Nothing else. After a while, he just said, "Probably some kind of drone," and went back inside. I stayed out a bit longer. I wanted to believe it was a drone too, but drones don't move like that. Not in complete silence, and definitely not underwater. A few minutes later, I heard the PA crackle as one of the crew announced we'd be docking soon. I looked down one last time before heading in. The water looked darker than before, like a shadow was drifting under the surface, but it could have just been the current. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of diesel. People were dozing or staring at their phones. Everything felt normal again, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone else should have noticed. When we docked, I followed the crowd off the boat and onto the terminal. The guy I'd talked to was a few people ahead of me in line. He looked back once, made brief eye contact, then turned away and kept walking. That night, I got home a little after midnight. My apartment in St. George overlooks part of the harbor, and out of habit, I stepped onto the balcony before bed. I could see another ferry heading back toward Manhattan, its lights cutting across the dark. I didn't expect to see anything, but as I leaned on the railing, I noticed something faint, a single point of white light low on the water, far out near the middle of the bay. It moved slow, steady, no blinking or strobe like a plane or boat. Then it faded out, almost like it sank again. I went inside and shut the blinds. The next evening, I was back at work. Around 9:30 on my break, I told one of the line cooks about it. His name's Luis. He's from Staten Island too, takes the same ferry sometimes. He laughed and said I was probably overtired. Then, he got a little more serious and said a few years ago, some of the ferry guys saw weird lights out near the Narrows at night, like orbs moving just under the surface. He said they stopped talking about it because no one believed them. That stuck with me. 2 nights later, I finished another late shift and caught the 11:30 again. I didn't plan to go outside, but I ended up doing it anyway. The air was warmer that night, calmer. The city looked hazier, like there was low fog over the harbor. I stood near the same spot on the starboard side, gripping the cold railing. For most of the ride, nothing happened. Then, right before we reached the midpoint, I thought I saw movement again. Not light this time, just a shape. The surface rippled in a tight circle, like something large had passed beneath. I waited, scanning the water. Nothing. Just the faint glow from the ferry lights playing across the waves. When we docked, I noticed a few people looking out the windows toward the water as we slowed down, whispering to each other. A woman in a long coat tapped the glass and frowned. I didn't catch what she said, but one of the deckhands told everyone to stay clear until the ramp dropped. As we disembarked, I glanced back and saw 2 of the crew leaning over the rail with flashlights. They weren't joking or laughing. One of them crouched down like he was trying to get a better angle, then looked over his shoulder and waved someone else over. I didn't stick around to see more. When I got home that night, I went straight to bed. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to a low humming noise. Not loud, just a steady vibration, like distant machinery. I thought it was a garbage truck at first, but when I looked outside, the street was empty. The sound seemed to come from the harbor. I stepped out onto the balcony again. The sky was clear this time, stars faint behind city light. The water looked calm, but I could see a pale reflection moving across it, not from a boat, not from any light I could trace. It moved in a long, slow arc, then blinked out. The humming stopped at the same moment. I stood there a while, waiting for it to come back, but it didn't. The air felt heavy, like everything was holding still for a few seconds before resuming its normal rhythm. In the morning, I walked down to the ferry terminal early, just to see. Everything looked completely normal. Commuters rushing for coffee, pigeons everywhere, nothing strange about the water. But right near the edge of the dock, where the sunlight hit the surface, I noticed a long, thin streak of discoloration. It looked like a burn mark underwater, if that makes sense. A perfect line, pale against the dark harbor floor, stretching out toward the middle of the bay. I stared at it for a while before heading inside. Nobody else seemed to notice. That night, I took the train home instead. It was late August, a humid night that never really cooled down even after the sun dipped. My friend Kyle and I were both 17, about to start senior year, and had driven out to Pine Bush because we'd heard people talk about weird lights out there. Everyone in that part of upstate New York knows Pine Bush's reputation, but we weren't really believers. It was just something to do. Get out of the house, drive back roads, listen to music, maybe spot something that would make a good story later. We left his place in Montgomery around 10, grabbed a couple sodas from Stewart's, and took Route 52 until we turned off onto one of those narrow dirt roads that wind through the woods. The air smelled like rain, even though it hadn't rained in days. The trees were thick, leaning in close, and the headlights caught the shimmer of spiderwebs hanging between branches. After a while, we found a small clearing that looked like it had been used by hunters or off-roaders. Flattened grass, a burned-out fire ring, a few beer cans. We pulled in, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle. Out there, it's dark in a way city people don't understand. No streetlights, no hum of traffic, just a faint chorus of insects and the occasional whip poor will. Kyle lit a cigarette and we just sat there talking about school, girls, college stuff. He leaned his seat back, flicking ash out the window. I had the windows cracked, the radio low, classic rock fuzzing in and out. It must have been around 11:15 when I noticed something moving through the trees. At first I thought it was just a distant plane, but the light was too low, way too low. It was this white, clean light, not flickering or colored like a star. It moved slow, almost deliberate, drifting downward through the trees toward the base of the hill. "Kyle, look," I said, nodding toward it. He sat up and squinted. "What the hell is that?" We both rolled our windows down further. The air that came in was heavy and damp. The light got brighter as it descended, like it was getting closer to the ground. It wasn't blinding, more like looking at the beam of a giant flashlight from a distance. What freaked me out was how it didn't make any noise. No rotors, no engine, nothing. Just the hum of crickets and frogs around us. We watched it drop behind the trees maybe a quarter-mile away, and then the forest lit up. You could see every branch, every shadow stretching long across the clearing. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it went dark. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Kyle finally muttered, "Maybe a helicopter?" But he didn't sound convinced. I said, "Then where's the sound?" We sat there another few minutes, expecting to hear someone. Hikers, cops, something. Nothing. Just that deep silence. Kyle turned the key halfway to power the radio again, but all we got was static. Every single station. He tried switching through them and laughed nervously, like it was just bad reception. I checked my phone. No signal. Not one bar. Normally, you at least get something out there, even if it's weak. "Let's go check it out," he said. I told him that was a bad idea. It was pitch black past the headlights, and if it really was something like a crash or equipment or whatever, we'd be stumbling around in the dark with no way to call for help. But he was already halfway out of the car, cigarette dangling from his lips. We walked maybe 20 yards from the clearing before I stopped. The forest felt wrong. Not just quiet, but still. No bugs, no leaves rustling, no frogs. The air had this faint electric smell, like the air before lightning. Kyle kept going another few steps before he froze. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I didn't at first, but then I caught it. A faint vibration, not exactly a sound, but a feeling, like when a big truck passes and you feel it through your chest. It was coming from the direction where the light had gone down. That was enough for me. I said, "We should get back to the car." He didn't argue. We started back, and that's when the vibration stopped. Dead silent again. No breeze, no insects. I could feel sweat rolling down my neck, even though it wasn't that hot anymore. When we got back into the car, the metal body felt slightly warm, like it had been sitting in the sun all day, even though we'd been parked for almost an hour. Kyle shut his door and said quietly, "Okay, that's weird." We sat there debating what to do. Drive toward where we saw it, or head home. The radio was still static, and neither of our phones would connect. Kyle was staring out the windshield when he suddenly said, "It's back." I looked up, and through the trees, I saw the same light again. Only now it wasn't moving. It was hovering between the trunks, perfectly still, about the height of the treetops. It wasn't shining outward anymore, just glowing with this dull white that didn't flicker. We killed the headlights and just watched it. The glow reflected faintly off the trees and ground. Every instinct told me to leave, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Then it blinked. Not like a light turning off, but like something enormous shifting behind it, blocking it for a fraction of a second. When it came back on, it was closer. Kyle whispered, "Dude, go." I turned the key, the engine sputtered, and for a second I thought it wasn't going to start. Then it caught, headlights flaring back on. When I looked again, the light was gone. Just trees. We didn't talk on the drive back to Montgomery. The road was empty the whole way, no other cars, no animals. At some point, the radio came back. just fuzz that turned into a commercial for a car dealership like nothing happened. When we hit town limits, both our phones buzzed at the same time, signal back. Kyle said, "What time you got?" I checked mine, 12:52. That didn't make sense. We couldn't have been out there more than 40 minutes, maybe an hour tops. He showed me his screen, same time. Neither of us could explain it. When I got home, I plugged my phone in and checked the clock on the microwave. It said 11:58. So did the clock on the stove. My phone was an hour ahead. I restarted it, thinking maybe it was a glitch. Still showed 12:58. The weird thing? The weather app said I was in Wurtsboro, which was 20 miles away. The next morning, everything was normal again. Phone time synced with the house, GPS worked fine, radio clear. I texted Kyle and asked if his phone was still weird. He said it was fine too, but his camera roll had a new file timestamped 12:32 a.m. It was black, just pure black. No sound, no image. He swore he didn't take it. We didn't go back to Pine Bush after that. A week later, he said he drove past that same road in daylight on his way to a job site. He told me there was no clearing anymore, just trees. He said maybe he'd turned onto the wrong path, but he recognized the turnoff, the split in the guardrail. The place where we parked didn't exist. I never checked for myself. Sometimes late at night, if I drive that way, I'll turn down the radio and roll the window down just to listen. The woods out there still go completely silent sometimes, not for long, maybe a few seconds, like everything is holding its breath. I keep driving when that happens. It was close to midnight when I left my buddy's place in Saratoga Springs. We'd been watching a game, had a few beers, and I was heading home to Corinth. It's maybe a half-hour drive, mostly through back roads lined with thick woods. The sky was clear, just a few stars visible between branches, and the air had that early spring chill where you can see your breath a little. The first 20 minutes were nothing unusual. Empty road, no headlights behind me, just the low hum of the tires and the occasional whine from the transmission when I hit a bump. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station out of Albany. But right after I turned onto Middle Grove Road, the signal cut out completely. Static. I fiddled with the tuner, tried a few different stations. Nothing but white noise. Even the phone lost signal. I figured it was just one of those dead zones in the hills. A few minutes later, I saw light behind me. I thought it was another car catching up, so I checked the mirror, but it didn't look right. It wasn't the usual twin headlights, it was just one bright, almost pure white circle. Not bluish like LED headlights or yellow like halogens. It was clean, almost sterile looking, and it didn't bounce the way headlights do over uneven road. It stayed perfectly level. I slowed down a bit to let whoever it was pass, but the light didn't close the distance. It stayed maybe 100 yards behind, dead center in the lane. When I sped up, it matched my speed. When I slowed, it slowed. That's when I started getting uneasy. I pulled over once, pretending to check my GPS, thinking maybe I'd just let it pass, but when I stopped, it stopped too. The brightness didn't change, but it wasn't blinding, more like it was glowing through the trees. I rolled my window down to listen. No engine noise, no tires on gravel, nothing. After maybe 30 seconds, I put the car in drive and started rolling again. The light followed. I told myself it was probably some guy with a spotlight mounted on his truck screwing around. But then I realized the road was narrow, only one lane in each direction and winding. The way that light stayed perfectly steady dead center didn't make sense. Around that point, I came up on a dirt service road that led off into the woods. I'd passed it a few times before. It wasn't gated, just a rough path utility trucks use sometimes. I figured if someone was following me, I could pull down there, kill the lights, and see what they did. I turned onto it fast, tires crunching over gravel. The trees closed in almost immediately, branches brushing the roof. I drove maybe 50 feet in, cut the engine, and shut off my headlights. The forest went completely black. I sat still, barely breathing, watching the mirror. The white light slowed on the main road, then came to a stop. It didn't swing its beam around or search. It just hung there, completely motionless between the trees. I thought it was some kind of drone at first, but it was big, maybe the size of a car hood. The shape was hard to make out, but there was a faint edge to it, like a disc or oval. No sound at all. I waited. A minute passed. then 2. The light didn't move an inch. I remember turning my ignition key halfway, not to start the car, just enough to bring the dash lights on so I could glance at the clock. It was 12:23. I looked back. Still there. At some point, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt. The light began to pulse very slowly, dimming just a little, then brightening again. Not rhythmic, like breathing almost. Something about that made my stomach flip. I turned the key the rest of the way, headlights back on, and reversed quickly, gravel kicking up. The second my tires hit the main road again, the light flickered, then shot upward. Straight up, not diagonally, just vertically, until it disappeared into the tree line above. No sound, no trail, just gone. I sat there in the middle of the road, heart racing, headlights pointed down an empty stretch of asphalt. I waited for another car to come by, but the road stayed empty. The rest of the drive home was quiet. The radio was still dead, even after I got closer to town. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the clock on the dashboard read 1:02. The drive from that turnoff shouldn't have taken more than 15 minutes. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and just listened to the refrigerator hum for a while. Around 1:20, I checked my phone, full bars, and the time matched the dash clock. No missed calls, no messages. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that white glow behind the trees. The next morning, I drove back out there. I stopped at the same spot on Middle Grove and looked down that service road. The entrance was muddy, tire tracks everywhere, but mine were still visible. You could see where I'd turned in, reversed out. Nothing else. I followed the dirt path on foot for maybe 100 feet just to see if there were any signs of someone else being there. There weren't. No footprints, no cigarette butts, no broken branches. But in one patch of soft ground, maybe halfway down, the soil was darker, or like it had been baked or burned. About a 6-foot circle, smooth around the edges, almost perfect. It didn't smell like smoke or fuel. It just looked wrong. The mud around it was still damp from the rain earlier that week, but that patch was completely dry, cracked even. I crouched down to touch it. The ground was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air. A car came up behind me on the main road, and I stood up fast. It was a county truck, probably a utility guy. He slowed down, saw me, and asked if everything was okay. I told him I'd seen a light out there the night before and wanted to make sure it wasn't someone camping illegally or something. He looked down the dirt path, squinted a bit, and said, "Yeah, people say they see stuff out here sometimes. Must be the base." When I asked what base, he said there used to be some kind of radar testing facility farther north back in the 70s, and maybe the military still used parts of it. I nodded, pretended that made sense, and left it at that. Driving home again in daylight felt strange. Everything looked normal, just pine trees, gray pavement, birds hopping along the shoulder. But every so often I'd glance in the rearview mirror and half expect that light to be there again. That night, I went to back up the dashcam footage from my car. It's one of those cheap ones that overwrites itself every few hours. The video from the drive started fine. Headlights, road, static on the radio. Then, right around when the radio cut out, the recording glitched. The next timestamp jumped forward 13 minutes. After that, it showed me turning into my driveway. There's no footage of the light. None. I tried not to obsess over it, but I kept thinking about that burned patch in the dirt. I went back again 2 days later, early in the morning this time. The ground was cold, damp from dew. The patch was still there, but fainter, like it had been fading. The edges were softer, less defined. I stood there for a while watching the trees. It was dead quiet, not even wind. For a second, I thought I saw something pale move between the trunks. Not light, exactly, more like a reflection that shouldn't have been there. Then a bird startled and flew off, and I realized how tense I'd been standing. I walked back to the car and drove home. I haven't been down that road at night since. The only strange thing after that was about a week later. I was coming out of work, and when I started my car, the radio, which had been fine all week, suddenly blared static again for about 10 seconds before the signal came back. It was that same station out of Albany. I didn't think much of it, but when I looked at the clock, the time had reset to 12:23. I was driving home from a late client meeting in Poughkeepsie, probably around 11:15 p.m., taking Route 9 because it's faster at night and there's almost no traffic. The air had that heavy, humid feel that hangs over the Hudson Valley in late July, and a faint mist was rising off the trees on either side of the road. It was one of those nights where everything smells sharper: cut grass, wet asphalt, river water, and it somehow makes you more aware of quiet things. I had just passed the small cluster of houses near Wappingers when I noticed brake lights ahead. At first, I assumed it was a minor accident or someone pulling over to check a flat. But as I got closer, I saw a dozen cars lined up on the shoulder, all with hazard lights flashing. People were standing outside, looking uphill toward the west side of the valley. Curiosity got the better of me. I eased my car onto the shoulder and cut the engine, leaving the interior lights off. It was unusually silent, just the occasional chirp of crickets, the hum of distant traffic from the Taconic Parkway. I stepped out and squinted toward the hills, and that's when I saw them. There were maybe 6 or 7 red lights hovering low over the valley. Not flashing or blinking like aircraft warning lights, just solid, steady red. They moved slowly, like someone was drawing them through the sky with a brush. They were close enough that I could see the faint glow reflecting off the mist in the valley below, but far enough away that I couldn't make out any shape, just points of light. People were whispering. Some were taking photos with their phones, but most were just staring. I remember thinking that even if someone had rigged a bunch of drones, they'd make a sound. These were silent, drifting perfectly in formation, like they were tethered to nothing. I leaned against the hood of my car, trying to get a sense of what I was looking at. The lights shifted slightly, one rising, another descending. They moved as a group, almost like birds in a V formation, but too slow, too deliberate. I felt the hair on my neck stand up. I don't normally get freaked out, but this was different. After a few minutes, maybe 5, they started fading. Not moving away or turning off, but dimming evenly, until the red glow was just a faint ember, and then nothing. The mist over the valley looked ordinary again. The trees, the hills, everything was quiet. It felt like someone had erased it. People around me were murmuring, some laughing nervously, saying it was probably a fire on a distant hill or a helicopter, but no one sounded convinced. I checked my phone. Full signal, no alerts, no emergency notices, no news. I drove on slowly, glancing at the valley to see if anything would reappear. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I kept noticing small things that didn't make sense. My headlights seemed brighter than usual, reflecting off the mist in uneven ways. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move across the road up ahead, but when I slowed down, nothing was there. I got home around midnight. Erin was asleep when I came in. I didn't mention it, not because I was embarrassed, but because she tends to overreact, and I wasn't ready to explain what I saw. I double-checked the house, windows and doors, just like I always do at night, and everything seemed normal. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about it. I checked local news sites and social media. Nothing about mysterious lights over the Hudson Valley. Some people posted photos on Instagram, mostly blurry red dots in the sky, but nothing concrete. A week later, I drove the same stretch of Route 9 during the day this time, just to see if I could make sense of it. The shoulder looked normal. No signs of fire or activity, no odd marks on the road. Everything was ordinary, but my mind kept drifting back to that night. The strangest part was how calm the valley felt when the lights were gone. It's like the air carried a weight for those 5 minutes, and then it lifted. I keep thinking about it when I drive that way now, late at night, looking out across the hills. Sometimes in the faint glow of distant city lights, I swear I see a flicker of red, but then it's gone. I haven't gone back to the shoulder at night. I drive past it and glance over, just out of habit, but I don't stop. People talk about drones, reflections, atmospheric conditions, but none of that explains how it moved, how perfectly silent it was, or how it just faded into nothing. The memory of the lights stays with me, though. It wasn't frightening exactly, but it was deeply unsettling. Something in that valley was behaving in ways I couldn't predict or understand. And I've realized that part of living here is accepting that some nights, some things don't make sense. I still drive Route 9 at night, usually alone. I watch the valley, sometimes talking to myself, quietly, joking that I'll see those lights again. But I haven't, and maybe I don't want to. The emptiness after they disappeared is just as strange as the lights themselves. Like the world briefly shifted and then everything snapped back into place. It was around 10:30 on a Wednesday night. I remember because I had just finished a Zoom call for work that ran way longer than it should have. My wife, Erin, was already in bed upstairs, and I was cleaning up the kitchen, just kind of decompressing. It was one of those muggy summer nights where the air feels thick, even after dark. I live in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Rochester, Greece, technically. Mostly single-family homes with fenced yards and big trees. You can hear the expressway faintly if the wind's right. The trash pickup is early Thursday mornings, so I figured I'd take the bins out before heading upstairs. I grabbed the bag from under the sink, tied it off, and stepped into the garage. The motion light flicked on, buzzing faintly. I remember noticing how still it was outside. No crickets, no wind, just that heavy, humid air. Even the street seemed unusually quiet. When I lifted the lid on the trash can, I saw this faint light moving across the yard behind my house. At first, I thought it was a plane. We're under a flight path, and you get small ones heading toward the airport all the time. But this wasn't like that. It wasn't blinking. It was steady and white, and moving slower than anything I'd seen before. I set the trash down and just watched. The light got brighter, and as it passed over the trees, I realized it wasn't just a dot. It had shape, wide and curved like a boomerang, or maybe a crescent. It looked solid, not like a searchlight or drone. There were no red or green marker lights, no sound at all, just this smooth, glowing arc gliding silently maybe 200 feet up, tops. It moved from west to east, slow and steady, and the weirdest thing was the way it seemed to reflect light downward, like the underside had a dull glow, enough to light up the tops of the trees for a second as it passed. I stood there, squinting, trying to make sense of it. After a few seconds, it looked like it started turning, banking left, almost pivoting in place. That's when it hit me how quiet everything was. I should have been able to hear something. Wind, an engine, anything. There was nothing. Just that soundless motion. I ran back into the kitchen to grab my phone. It was charging on the counter, so I yanked it off and hurried back to the door. But right as I reached for the handle, all the lights in the house flickered. Not just dimmed, they went completely out for maybe half a second, then came back on. The microwave clock reset. I remember hearing the fridge compressor kick off, then back on again. When I opened the door, the garage light was dead. It didn't come back on. I stepped out anyway, holding my phone up like a flashlight. The air felt different, kind of charged, like before a thunderstorm, even though the sky was clear. The thing, whatever it was gone. The sky looked normal again. No glow, no movement, just stars and a faint orange haze from the city in the distance. I walked to the end of the driveway, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I waited maybe 30 seconds, phone in hand, before finally opening the camera app. The second I did, the app froze. The screen went black, then dumped me back to the home screen. I tried again. Same thing. I switched to video. Same. At that point, I wasn't exactly scared, more just unsettled. Everything felt off. I could still hear that low hum in my ears, though I couldn't tell if it was real or just me noticing silence too hard. I went inside, and the kitchen lights flickered again, briefly this time. The digital clock on the oven was flashing 12. I unplugged my phone and checked the time. It said 11:42. I remember thinking that couldn't be right. It hadn't been that long since I'd gone out. Maybe 10 minutes, tops. I checked the wall clock above the fridge. It said 10:51. I assumed my phone had glitched from the brief power surge, but when I plugged it back in, it synced automatically and still said 11:42. I even turned on the TV just to check. The local channel's news had already started, so apparently it was 11:42. Somehow, almost an hour had gone by. I stood there trying to piece it together. I hadn't gone anywhere. I'd been outside maybe 2 or 3 minutes, 5 at most. Erin called down from upstairs asking what happened to the lights. I just told her the power flickered, didn't mention the rest. Later, after she fell back asleep, I went outside again. I wanted to see if maybe a transformer had blown or if there was a drone somewhere. The garage light still wouldn't turn on. I had to use my phone flashlight, There were no strange sounds, no lights in the distance, just wet grass and the faint hum of air conditioners from down the street. But when I looked at the trash can, I noticed something strange. The lid was slightly ajar. I always close it tight because of raccoons. I lifted it again, thinking maybe the bag had settled, but it was still sealed. I could have sworn I heard a faint crackling sound from the trees behind the yard, like static. I stayed out there for maybe another minute before going back in. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked the house. All the clocks were fine, except the microwave and oven. The garage light came on like normal when I left for work. I even checked the circuit breaker just to be sure. Everything was in order. At lunch, I mentioned it to my coworker, Nate. He's from Henrietta, big into astronomy, so I figured he might have seen something similar. He just shrugged and said maybe it was a private drone. But when I told him about the power flicker and the time jump, he got quiet for a second. Then he said his power had blinked too, around 10:30, but his phone hadn't changed. That night, I went online and tried to find anything about a power outage or aerial activity. Nothing. No weather reports, no military training, no flight paths matching that direction. A few days later, on Saturday, I went to take the trash out again and noticed the same stillness. No bugs, no breeze. It wasn't quite the same, but it made me pause. I stood in the driveway and just watched the sky for a while. Every plane, every blinking light, all normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, like a sound I didn't realize I'd gotten used to until it stopped. One last thing, I didn't notice it until Sunday morning. On the lid of the trash can, right near the handle, there was a faint crescent-shaped mark. Not a scratch, not dirt, like something slight burned into the plastic but without melting it, about the size of my hand. It looked exactly like the shape I'd seen in the sky. I showed it to Erin, but she said it was probably from when I leaned something hot against it. I couldn't remember ever doing that. I even tried scrubbing it off. It didn't fade. It's still there, actually. If you catch it in the right light, it's this dull, silvery outline that shouldn't be there. I've thought about replacing the bin, but I keep putting it off. Sometimes when I'm out late, maybe taking the dog out or getting something from the car, I'll catch myself scanning the sky without thinking. I don't expect to see anything, but there's a weird part of me that wonders if I already did and just didn't understand what I was looking at. It started around 10:45 p.m. on a Friday in early September. My girlfriend, Laura, and I had driven up to the Finger Lakes for the weekend, just a short getaway from the city. We rented a small Airbnb right on the edge of Seneca Lake. The place was rustic but cozy. Big windows facing the water, a fire pit out back, and no neighbors close enough to see the lake from their property. That's why we picked it. Somewhere quiet, somewhere we could actually hear ourselves think. The night had been warm and sticky, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. After unpacking and having a couple beers, we decided to sit outside on the deck. Laura had her sketchbook, and I had my notebook, mostly just scribbling random notes and doodles while we talked. The lake was perfectly still. Usually there's some breeze or the faint chop of a passing boat, but that night it was like glass. We noticed the first light around 10:50. At first I assumed it was a plane. The lake's wide enough that flights heading to Syracuse or Rochester sometimes pass overhead. It was a faint, white-orange glow reflecting softly on the water, just a little pulsing, like the light was breathing. Laura pointed it out first. "Look," she said. "See how it's moving?" I squinted. It wasn't really moving across the lake. It stayed in roughly the same spot, but the reflection on the water wavered. That's when I realized there were 3 distinct points of light, spaced evenly, almost forming a triangle. "Maybe a helicopter?" I said. "Or a small plane. Could be one of those crop dusting things." Laura shook her head. "It's too high for that. And it's pulsing. That doesn't make sense." We both went quiet for a minute, just watching. The lights pulsed again, slowly in unison, like someone was adjusting the intensity. What made it strange was the reflection. Normally, reflections on water mirror the movement in the sky, but these lights almost seemed anchored to the lake's surface. The tops of the trees on the opposite shore weren't catching any of the glow. It was purely in the water. I grabbed my phone to take a picture, but by the time I opened the camera app, the reflections started moving. Not the lights in the sky, I couldn't actually see the light sources clearly. But the reflections split. Two moved slowly apart in opposite directions, still pulsing faintly, while the third stayed roughly in place. Did you see that?" Laura whispered. I nodded, still holding my phone, and started filming. The reflections drifted for maybe 20 seconds, slow, deliberate. I couldn't hear anything. No engine, no rotors, no distant hum. Just the lake, quiet and smooth, like nothing existed beyond our deck. By the time I looked up from the screen, the lights in the sky, if they were even there, had gone. There was nothing above us, just stars. But the reflections lingered a little longer, moving across the water until they faded entirely, like the lake had absorbed them. I lowered my phone and stared. That's not normal. Laura was biting her lip. Maybe it's some kind of weird light reflection from the city? She gestured toward Geneva, about 10 miles away. But the city's lights are farther, and they don't move like that. We stayed out there for a while, just watching the lake, half expecting something else to appear. But the water remained flat, unbroken, ordinary. We went inside, locked the sliding door, and tried to shake off the weird feeling. Later, we went back to the deck with mugs of tea. Everything looked normal, but the lake felt different, like it had been holding something, and now it was gone. I tried to describe it to Laura. It's like it left an echo. I said, "You know that feeling when the room goes completely quiet after a train passes?" "But longer," she nodded. "Yeah, and it's not just the lake. Even the air feels different." The next morning, we walked down to the water. Nothing. The surface was clear, the trees ordinary, the air just fresh and humid from overnight dew. No marks, no unusual reflections, no disturbance of any kind. We spent the day in town, trying to distract ourselves, and we didn't talk much about it. When we mentioned it to the Airbnb owner, he laughed and said the lake does weird stuff sometimes. Reflections, fog, optical illusions. But it didn't sound like anything he'd ever seen. That night, we stayed on the deck again, hoping maybe to see something else. Not out of curiosity exactly, but out of a quiet need to understand. The lake was calm, the stars bright, but nothing happened. No lights, no reflections, nothing that seemed unusual. We left the next morning. On the drive back toward the thruway, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting a glow to follow us, but there was nothing. The world felt normal again. Even now, when I think about it, it doesn't make sense. 3 lights, pulsing reflections, moving in perfect separation, and then nothing. There was no noise, no indication of aircraft, no evidence of anything at all. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the lake again. I can almost see the reflections, faint and slow, drifting apart. I can feel that weight in the air, like something unseen passing just above the water. But every time I glance at the Finger Lakes on a map, they look ordinary, quiet, untouched. I tell Laura, maybe we just got lucky, or unlucky, to see something that shouldn't be there. She smiles, nods, but we both know it wasn't luck. It wasn't anything we can explain. It just happened, and that's the strange part. I woke to the sound of my own breath and a light I couldn't place. We'd set up the tent the night before at a small, primitive site on the western shore of Tupper Lake. 3 of us, me, Kayla, and her brother Jonah, trying to get away from the city for a long weekend. It rained late, then cleared, and the night had been thick with stars and the smell of wet pine. I remember falling asleep to the slap of mosquitoes against the tent fabric and the small snore Jonah makes when he drinks too much coffee. I opened the tent flap because the heat had started to build and thought I was walking into sunrise. Except my watch said 3:12 a.m., and there was no sun. Instead, a thin fog lay along the shoreline, and it glowed from inside. Not the bright, theatrical glow of a flashlight, more like an inner light, faint and even, as if the mist itself were lit from within rather than from some outside source. The glow washed across the lake, softening the black into a milky sheet. Kayla stirred and rolled over. "You see that?" she whispered. Her voice had that edge, half sleeping, half alert, that makes everything sound like a secret. We slipped out barefoot. The ground under our feet felt sponge soft from the night's rain. Jonah was out before us, already up on the little rock outcrop by the fire pit, silhouetted against the pale fog. He didn't say much at first, just a low, "Huh." and then he reached for his thermos, hands steady like he'd seen the thing before. He hadn't. The first small thing I noticed was the silence. Usually at that hour, the frogs made a steady chorus, and somewhere out of sight, a loon checked in, this long, shaking cry that ruins quiet in the best way. That night, the frogs were gone. The loon didn't call. Even the wind had folded itself away. It was the kind of absence that makes your ears ring. Jonah shuffled forward, and the fog clung to his calves. It smelled faintly of ozone, sharp and clean like the air after distant lightning. Kayla shook the sleeve of her hoodie and said the hair on her arms had stood up. She's usually more dramatic about small things, but this wasn't a small thing. Our phones were useless. Full bars the night before, now the screens read, "No service," and the battery percentages had slipped in the few minutes it took us to crawl out of the tent. My phone had been at 80% before I turned it off. Now it was down to 9 and warming in my hand. Jonah's cheap point-and-shoot camera powered on with a blink, and then the lens cover refused to retract. You learn to shrug when electronics act out in the woods. Wet contacts, cheap batteries, but the timing felt wrong. We sat on the rock and watched. The fog ribboned across the water like a slow current. Sometimes the glow pooled into little brighter knots and then bled out again. After a few minutes, a low hum started, so soft at first I thought it was my teeth, underneath everything else. Then the hum built, not loud, but a steady, rhythmic pulsing. It had a beat, almost like a very slow throat clearing in the sky. Our feet vibrated with it through the stone. "Maybe somebody's testing a buoy," Kayla offered, but she sounded thin. Out here, the nearest marina was a good 20 minutes by boat. There weren't supposed to be lights out on the water like that at this hour, for reasons I can't justify beyond how people tend to be asleep on Sunday before dawn. The fog moved in ways water shouldn't. The outer edge trembled inward occasionally, like breath fog curling around something warm. Once, a faint green thread, threaded through the white, ran parallel to the shoreline for a breath and vanished. I blinked and told myself I'd misread reflection off Jonah's thermos. Jonah pointed and said, "Look," and that made me feel small and a little stupid for wanting an explanation that fit. The hum became tangible. Kayla put her hands to her ears and frowned. "My head's ringing," she said. She's a nurse, and she speaks about sounds like she can see them. I felt it too, less in my ears than in the bones of my hands where they rested on my knees. There was a regularity to it, long, low pulses, like someone slowly tapping a metal drum across the other side of the lake. We tried to film it. No one thought to call anyone else. It felt private, like trespassing on a moment. My phone camera refused to focus. The screen showed shifting patterns of white and then a black frame where the recording should be. Jonah's video file corrupted as soon as he hit stop. Kept thinking about that, how the cameras misbehaved, but nothing else seemed broken. Then something moved in the mist, not on the surface but rising from it. At first I thought it was a boat cresting, and boats make noise, but there was no sound. The fog parted like a curtain and a shape emerged from the lake. It was tall, taller than a person standing on the water, but the edges were soft, not a hard silhouette. It rose up slowly, deliberate and smooth, like something inflated from the bottom. The inner glow of the fog pooled at the base and then tightened around the shape as if forming a skin. We didn't breathe for a full minute. Jonah's thermos fell from his hands and spat coffee into the moss. The drops made tiny mirrors and then were swallowed by the fog. The shape had a faint verticality to it, elongated, maybe the width of a small boat at the bottom, tapering as it climbed. But that could have been tricks of light. I could not tell if it had any surface detail. It had no obvious limbs, no recognizable features. It moved with an economy of motion that felt practiced. As it rose, it carried the hum with it, and the rhythm changed. Shorter pulses, higher pitch, like the throat clearing shifted into a different register. The fog nearest it brightened, and I could see small motes in the light that looked almost organic. They swam around like plankton. I tried to step forward and felt myself hesitate, like a magnet had hooked the sole of my shoe. The smell of ozone became stronger and coppery. My wristwatch, an old field watch with a mechanical movement, ticked forward a little too fast. By the time the thing reached 3 times its height, it read 328. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I'd lost time because the last thing I remembered precisely was the watch showing 3:12 when I unzipped the tent. Kayla? I said, and she mouthed something. Her lips formed letters, but no sound emerged. Jonah's jaw clenched like he was pressing the moment into his teeth. The shape paused above the lake and then tilted, not as if turning to look, but like the motion of a balloon catching a current. For a breath, it hovered with that same patient stillness. Then, without fanfare, it began to rise faster, not abruptly. There was none of that splintering acceleration you see in bad movies, but a steady lifting up through the thin cloud deck that suddenly seemed much lower than it should have been. As it went, the humming elongated into something that felt less like sound and more like an impression. The inner glow of the mist thinned and folded back in on itself. I tried to film again, knife-handed and cheap and useless. The phone registered the motion as a wash of light and a tiny black speck. Jonah's camera captured only a wavering smear that, when we played it back at full speed, looked like nothing at all. The thing rose into the cloud base, and when it reached the thicker layer, it simply blinked out. There was no burst, no flame, no noise, just a faint thinning of the fog, and then the sky looked like sky again, a flat gray ceiling where the glow had been. The hum faded on the same beat, the height disappeared. The frogs started up as if someone had turned a valve back on. The loon called once, a long, thin note that sounded like an unhappy ending. We sat on that rock a long time after, legs numb, watching the place where it had been. Kayla's hands shook as she tried to put the thermos back in her pack. Jonah smoked a cigarette that broke into ash in his fingers because none of us wanted to move. We checked the tent and our packs methodically, like that would prove we hadn't imagined anything. Nothing looked disturbed. The shoreline was intact. There were no footprints in the half-dry sand out to the water's edge where the shape had lifted. Time had moved differently for each of us, or so it seemed. My watch read 3:42. Kayla's digital alarm had jumped forward 19 minutes while hers had been turned off. Jonah swore his chronograph had lost about 7 minutes and then clicked back. We argued math for a while, how long it had lasted, who had seen what, and the numbers slid around in our mouths like gum. We left that morning before the county patrol got around, bags half packed, coffee cold in a thermos someone had forgotten to screw on. Road noise returned by degrees as we drove out. A dump truck, a dog barking, the low, ordinary rattle of pavement. We said very little on the ride home. Nobody wanted an explanation because the act of explaining felt like you might lose the thing altogether, and we were all curators of a small, bright secret. Back in the city, life stitched itself back into place. My phone found service again on the highway and synced the lost minutes like a small bureaucrat smoothing a wrinkle. When I checked the files later, the footage we'd taken was corrupted where the thing had been. The timestamps were inconsistent. Everyone I told had a reasonable sounding theory. Some said ball lightning, others said military tests, or friends doing performance art and spending more money than sense on fog machines. A few people suggested hallucination, sleep deprivation. Those last ones were the ones I liked least, because all three of us had been awake and sober, and we heard the hum in our bones and we'd smelled the ozone. I went back once the week after, in daylight, while the memory looked like the outline of something I could draw. The lakeshore was ordinary. Kids and kayaks, a thin jetty where people launched canoes. The water was the right, dull blue. The patch of fog that had seemed to glow was a piece of the lake like any other. I ran my hand through the sand where we'd stood and felt only silt. There were no burned rings, no scorched grass, nothing to point and say, "See?" Only the ordinary, which is the least satisfying answer. Sometimes at night, now when the city is quiet and the hum of the refrigerator is a background like fog, I think about the way that thing rose, how cleanly it left, and how small and precise the world felt in those minutes. The memory is there, bright and unhelpful, like a photograph with half the frame fogged over. We went home intact. We went back to our jobs. But every now and then I'll find my wristwatch a minute ahead, or smell that thin metallic tang without cause, and for a moment the lake is present again, glowing from within. I was out on the lake before sunrise because my job's been eating daylight, and the only time that felt like mine was the hour just before everything else woke up. I launched the kayak from the little public ramp at the east end of Cuca, had the boat strapped to the roof, an old P&H I'd learned to move like a pet, and shoved off in the dark with a thermos of coffee and the kind of silence you only get where there aren't houses with streetlights. No chop, no breeze, nothing to move the surface except for the thin wake my paddle made. I like that part, a slow cadence of left, right, left, watching the reflection of the hills fold under the boat, thinking about nothing complicated. At first, I noticed only small, ordinary things being slightly off. My phone, which I'd left in a dry bag, showed a single satellite signal when I checked it just to see where I'd drifted. That's unusual out there. Normally it snaps to 3 or 4, so the nav will behave. I shrugged and shoved the phone back under the bungee. It shouldn't have mattered. I was out to unwind. As the sky lightened to a dull pewter, the loons started. Usually they call in that thin, lonely voice that cuts through the air and makes everything feel deep. This morning, the first loon's call came, and then nothing. No echo from the other side of the lake. The second loon tried and stopped. It sounded like someone had put a finger on the sound. That little thing made the back of my neck prick up. You get used to the animal noises. When they're wrong, you notice it like a bruise you didn't know you had. About 30 minutes after push-off, I was crossing the narrow part near the old fishing pier. The water there runs deep in the channel, and the shoreline opens up so you can see a long way. I was about to pass the submerged merged breakwall when I saw the shape, but at first I thought some stupid party balloon or a weather balloon someone had launched, except it wasn't drifting. It was a disc, flat and gray, hovering maybe 10 feet above the surface, low enough that the bottom edge threw a darker ring on the water. It was the size of a small car, maybe a little wider. It wasn't reflective in that blinding way you expect from metal. It was matte, like brushed steel left to weather. There were no lights on it, no panels, no obvious seams. It simply held position above the lake. I slowed and stopped paddling because stopping seemed like the only reasonable thing to do. The lake swallowed the sound of my blades. It didn't hum or whine. It made nothing. If anything, the air around it felt slightly thicker, like the sound had been sucked out. I remember thinking, if that's a drone, the world's gone weird. If it's a plane, we need to be looking at an emergency. But it was neither. It hovered and did nothing dramatic, like a bird on a wire that had forgotten how to be a bird. I turned my head slowly and checked shorelines. No boats, no crews, no people with searchlights. The cabins on the west shore were still dark. The only movement was my little kayak and the faint rings spreading where a fish had bothered the surface to chase something invisible. I unzipped the dry bag and fumbled for my cheap digital camera. When I aimed it, the display went white for a second like it was overwhelmed, then settled to a gray rectangle that made the disc look like a blur. The file saved as corrupted when I hit stop. I didn't know if that was from the cold or from me being clumsy, but I'd used that camera 100 times and I didn't like the way it behaved. I eased the kayak forward, pushing the blade like clockwork, because the rational part of me wanted to see if whatever it was had a shape or if I was just seeing some trick of light. The closer I got, the more the hair on my arms lifted. Up close, you could see that it had a faint texture, like tiny, regular pitting in the surface, but nothing that read as a hatch or a seam. It reminded me of foam metal at a lab where they test machining. Purposeful, not random. It was brightening enough that the horizon was a strip of pale blush, and the disc was still in the same place, as if it was anchored. I wanted to shout or radio someone or do something adult and reasonable. Instead, I breathed and paddled and tried to make sense of how something that size could remain that perfectly still over a lake with no anchors, no visible means of support. Then the fog came. It rolled in like a hand, quick and thick. One moment I could see the far shore, and the next, the world narrowed to 20 feet. The morning temperature dropped. My breath skated in front of me. The fog wasn't the usual thin morning mist. It came in a wall, dense and gray, and it swallowed the disc so quickly I had to blink. 1 second the object was there, in the next it vanished, hidden inside the white. I turned in place, listening for any sound of it moving away, but the fog brought with it another thing, a low, steady hum. It wasn't loud, Not mechanical like a diesel, but I felt it in my teeth and along the flat of my palms where they rested on the paddle. It had a rhythm, not a beat, but a pressure that came in waves. Kayaks make a lot of small noises, plastic creaks, water skips, yet in that fog, the only thing that seemed to exist was that hum and the sound of the water breathing against my hull. I sought my watch because time felt weird when fog crept in that fast. My Apple Watch is useless out there without a phone signal, but I wear a cheap field watch too, mechanical and simple. The mechanical one, the one that ticked with a steady hand and that I trusted because you can hear it work, read 5:12 when I put it on. I'd checked it 2 minutes before the sighting, and it had read 5:06. I know the watch's feel. You can sense its little clicks. I remember thinking I must be misreading it. My hands were shaking, but the numbers were clear. 10 minutes unaccounted for between when I was about to pass the break wall and when the disc disappeared into fog. Inside that white, I could feel the world tilt a little. I paddled, slow strokes, and the kayak felt heavier as if the water had deepened. For the next minute, maybe two, the fog pressed against my face and everything was muffled and close. I tried to orient by the sound of the water and the barely perceptible hum. My phone finally came alive with a faint chirp. One bar of service flickered and then died, like a radio that had been tuned in for a blink. The fog thinned the same way it had come, without wind, like someone lifting a hand off a sheet. The disc was gone. No trailing vapor, no wake, nothing on the water. It was like the place where it had been sewn back together with ordinary air. I spun in the kayak, eyes scanning the gray, and the world looked as if no extraordinary thing had ever happened. I paddled back to the ramp in a slow loop, not eager to break the spell, but wanting the shore under my feet. When my hull scraped the ramp boards, my palms were numb, and the small hairs on my arms were matted with dew. I hauled the kayak up and sat for a long minute on the bench with a thermos between my knees, staring at the line where water met shore. The parking lot lights came on as a maintenance truck rolled by. The driver rolled down his window and called something into the cab about an early delivery. He didn't look like he'd seen anything. On the drive home, my phone synced and the clock in the dash lit up. My watch, stubborn and mechanical, had been exactly 10 minutes slow compared to the car clock. My phone history showed a 10-minute gap too. No GPS traces, like a seam in the record. I told myself some rational things as I drove. Condensation, a weird bank of fog, a cargo balloon no one reported. I tried to get conspiratorial and the words felt hollow in my mouth. I took the kayak off the car by noon and stored it in the garage. The camera file was still corrupted. A tech at the outlet later told me sometimes sensors freak out when exposed to bright point sources. Cheap electronics just melt on certain inputs. Maybe. My cheap field watch kept the 10-minute lag for a day and then settled back, as if whatever had nudged it loosened its influence. People I told at the hardware store shrugged and asked if I'd been out late drinking. A coworker joked and asked if I'd finally seen Bigfoot. The thing that stuck with me wasn't the shape itself. It was the way the world stilled around it. How birds forgot to call, how my electronics hiccuped, how fog could appear like a curtain. I've lived on lakes and rivers my whole life. You learn the language of weather, how to read a cloud, how to know a gust before it smacks you. This didn't fit that language. That night, sitting on my back steps with the window open, Lake Keuka looked ordinary under the streetlights. People had boats again, music drifting from one house, the sound tissue of summer. I wrote down the details in my notebook, time, place, how the fog came in a wall, because that's what I do when things don't fit. I make them line up on paper. If nothing else, I'd have a record of the morning. In the end, I went on with work and bills and the minor betrayals of everyday life. The watch kept its time then. My phone behaved. The camera wept no more corrupted files. But sometimes, when the morning is flat and the low clouds sit just above the hills, I find myself waking up earlier than I need to, paddling out and listening. I don't expect answers. I listen because there was a brief moment when the lake stopped being only a lake and was something else entirely, and for whatever reason, it saw fit to show me. I was coming back from Lake Placid that night, late enough that the gas stations were dark and the highway signs looked like they'd been bleached by the headlights of every car that had passed in the last 20 years. Route 28 through the Adirondacks gets dead quiet after 10, especially past Blue Mountain Lake, and I like it that way. You can drive for miles without another car, and the only sound is the tires on the asphalt and the occasional distant coyote. I had my music low, some old folk playlist, and I was thinking about the weekend. Camping, packing up, the little arguments over whose turn it was to clean the stove. The moon was thin, almost nothing, just enough to see the silhouette of the trees along the sides. And that's when I first noticed it, hovering above the road, maybe 50 yards ahead. It was a triangle, pure black against the gray of the night. Not huge, maybe the size of a small truck, but the shape was perfectly sharp. Edges crisp, no lights blinking, nothing that should have been there. I slammed my foot on the brake instinctively, but the car handled smooth, no skidding, just a little shudder. My hands gripped the wheel tight. It was just floating. No sound, no heat shimmer, no reflection from the headlights, except a dull mat that absorbed light in a way that made it look unreal, like a shadow someone had lifted and set down above the asphalt. I blinked. In that split second, it seemed farther than it had been, but it was impossible. I hadn't moved. I swerved slightly to the left, my heart hammering. I didn't hit it, which I still think is impossible because it was right there over the lane. The headlights didn't pick up any landing gear, no exhaust, no outline of anything mechanical. Just a black triangle, floating there, perfectly still, like it was waiting. Then it moved. Not down, not up, not in a straight line. It shifted laterally across the road, slowly, deliberately, without a sound. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a low-flying banner or a military drone, but the area is too remote, and at that altitude, I'd have heard something, seen something mechanical. I pulled off onto the shoulder, trying to calm my breathing, keeping my eyes on it in the rearview mirror. It didn't move closer to the trees, didn't vanish. It just hung there, unmoving, black as tar, and the headlights barely grazed it. I reached for my phone, which I'd been trying not to use because of dead spots in the mountains, but it had full signal for some reason. I snapped a picture, nothing. The camera showed only darkness. I tried video, blank frame, then static, like the sensor had been overloaded. After maybe 10 seconds, I swear it tilted slightly and disappeared. One moment it was there, hovering, then gone. No sound, no acceleration, nothing in the trees, nothing in the sky. I checked my GPS. It didn't register anything unusual, just my car blinking along the road. I sat there for a minute, heart hammering. The road was completely empty, not even a deer in the headlights. I tried calling my buddy Greg, who knows the area better than anyone. No answer, just static. I called again, holding the phone up, listening. On the third try, he picked up, groggy. Yo, what? Route 28, I said. By the second curve past the overlook. Did you see anything? No, he said. Are you drunk? I hung up. I wasn't drunk. I hadn't been drinking. I waited until I felt steady enough, then cautiously drove. Every shadow in the trees felt like it was moving. Every stretch of road was longer than it should be. I kept glancing in the mirror, expecting it to follow, but there was nothing. That's when the second strange thing happened. My odometer and trip meter didn't match the distance I'd traveled. The sign for the next curve came up almost instantly after I passed the last, like the road had shortened. I checked the dashboard clock. 10 minutes had passed that didn't line up with how long I'd been stopped on the shoulder or driving. I tried to rationalize. Maybe I dozed for a moment. Maybe it was the curve of the road, the dark, the trees. But my hands were sweaty, gripping the wheel the entire time. I hadn't closed my eyes. By the time I reached the Blue Mountain Lake exit, the weirdness had slowed. I kept thinking I'd catch a glimpse of it again, some reflection, some floating triangle, but there was nothing. Not in the sky, not in the trees, nothing on the roadside. At home, I parked in the driveway, switched off the headlights, and sat in the dark for a long time. The silence felt heavier than usual. Even the crickets seemed distant. I thought maybe it had been a trick of the moon, of the shadows, but I knew that triangle had been real. The next day, I drove the same stretch of Route 28 in daylight, careful to note every turn, every tree, every telephone pole. Nothing looked out of place. The road had the same dips and curves I remembered, the forest the same thickness, no signs of landing, no marks in the asphalt. I tried to tell Greg and a few coworkers. Most laughed, some nodded politely, then changed the subject. But I knew what I'd seen, and the way it moved, the way the light disappeared and time seemed off. That part stuck with me. Weeks later, I sometimes drive that stretch at night again. I keep the lights low, the radio off just to see. Nothing ever shows. But once in a while, when the wind shifts right, I swear I catch a flash of something black in the corner of my eye just above the trees, and I feel that same pulse in my chest, that same sudden awareness that the world isn't quite as ordinary as it seems. I still drive Route 28, but I don't do it the same way. Headlights full, hands steady, but always watching the dark because I know it could come back, or maybe I realize it never left at all. It started with the lights. I was headed back from the feed barn, lantern swinging in my hand, when I saw the first blink between the rows. It was coming from the lower block of Macintosh trees, the section we let go wild for a year so the birds had someplace to hide. I figured it was some teenager with a flashlight or a drunk driver passing on the old county road, so I slowed on the lane and listened. The dogs were quiet. Hector and Maeve usually made enough noise to wake the county, but that night they didn't even lift their heads from the porch. The light wasn't a beam, not really. It was a pale, steady flicker that moved like someone was tracing the trunks with a match and then stopping to look. It wasn't the flaring of headlamps or a phone screen. The color was off, sort of cool, like the inside of a glow stick you left out too long. I stayed behind the truck's wheel for a minute because even on this farm, you get careful about being a lone man in the dark. The lantern beside the cab made a small circle on the lane, and that felt like an island of normal. I killed the truck and climbed out anyway. The air was that late October kind, crisp enough to make the breath white in the lantern's light. I had my jacket zipped up and my boots still dusty from the day's pruning. The orchard smelled like dirt and crushed apples. The flicker stopped when I turned the corner of the barn, then started again a little deeper in the rows, like a child playing hide and seek with someone who didn't know the rules. Probably some kids, I muttered. Trash burners. I told myself that because it's what farmers tell themselves when something odd comes up at night. But the dogs were still quiet, and I knew every creak on the place. I started down the row, the lantern held high, boots sinking a little in the soft earth. The trees are a tangle at that end, old grafts, low branches. But there were no signs of a path, no crushed brush leading in. Everything looked like I'd left it at dusk. Leaves damp on the ground, fruit still heavy on their stems, a thin film of frost near the low spots. The second odd thing was the radio. I had the little farm handheld clipped to my belt. It's useless for anything but a long range when you need to talk to the picker crews. And when I tried the channel, the sound came back bent, like somebody had folded the words in half. Voices overlapped, not any of ours. Static that sounded almost like coughing. I thumbed the switch and it snatched back to silence. My hand felt colder after that. I kept walking. The flickering light moved again, now between two trees a few yards ahead, and I could see its reflection in the round backs of the apples, tiny pale moons rolling in the leaves. When I stopped, the light held. When I took another step, it bolted to the left and then hovered, patient as a moth. It wasn't random. I had the sense that it was watching the trees more than me. By the time I reached the spot, the light had been circling. My lantern showed only ordinary things. The gnarled trunks, a scattering of windfall fruit, a little tractor track where I'd tested the plow. I turned the lantern full on the base of one trunk and waited. Nothing moved. The only sound was the wind in the higher branches, a soft, papery whisper. Then, under the lantern's beam, I saw the impression. It was a perfect circle in the soil right at the drip line of the tree, maybe 3 feet across, slightly sunken, so the inner ring was a shade darker from the damp. The edges were neat and abrupt, like someone had pressed a cookie cutter down and then lifted it. There was no charring, no single scorch mark. The grass around it hadn't been bent out of place. No footprints ran away from it. It sat there like a shallow bowl someone had left to cool. I crouched. The earth was cool and slightly tacky. It looked as if the soil had been compressed, not compacted by a boot, but pressed evenly the way a hand can press dough onto a counter. When I ran a gloved finger along the rim, The soil gave with the same resistance as the rest of the ground. No ash, no smell of anything burning, no chemical rake. It made my skin crawl because I wanted a sign of something ordinary. A tire tread, a shoe sole, a broken twig. There was nothing. I stood and the light returned, as if that little pale thing had been waiting for me to notice. It drifted again between the rows, low to the ground this time, avoiding the trunks like it was aware they were obstacles. It didn't throw a beam into the sky. Instead, it moved with a patience that felt like intent. I called out, "Hey!" more for the sound than any useful purpose. The light paused for a breath, then slid away toward the next block and vanished behind a curtain of leaves. I ran. Stupid move. And when I came to that next clearing, there were 3 circles equally spaced like the seeds of some giant fruit. Each was the same diameter, the same neat rim, the same shallow bowl. All of them lay where the roots spread, on the undisturbed loam. No footprints between them, no tire tracks, nothing. I walked in a ring around the middle one, checking for differences. The grass bent the same way around each rim, and the only things out of place were the circles themselves. I knew the rows intimately enough to tell you where a mole had tunneled last spring, and this was not a mole's work. The third odd thing, if you're keeping count, was the timing. My phone, which I'd left in the barn on purpose because battery life is a joke and signal is spotty, buzzed in my pocket because the farmers group chat sent a chirp. I checked it with a shaking hand. There was a message from Carla across the valley. Lights out your way with 3 question marks. The timestamp said 11:07. My watch said 10:52. For a second, I thought I was misreading the phone, or the phone had been set ahead. Later, when Carla called from her porch light, she said she and her husband had seen flickering in their own orchard on the ridge across from us, and that the local feed mill had called to ask if anyone had authorized night testing. Nobody had. I told her I'd call the sheriff, and she laughed. Said what would she say, that lights were skipping between trees like fireflies with a plan? We walked back to the house and grabbed flashlights. I called my neighbor Dom. He's been here longer than anyone, and his ears are tuned to farm noises. He met me at the fence line with his shop light and an old shotgun he uses mostly for rattlesnakes and hard winter raccoons. We walked past the circles, lined up several of us now, Dom, Carla, me, and a kid from the feed store carrying a truck lamp that hummed. The light that had been flickering wasn't there, but the orchard felt like the moment before rain. The stillness thick and waiting. Birds were not moving. Even the tractors out on the county road had let off. We found more circles, a ring next to the cider press shed, another behind the pack house where we keep the boxes. Some were cleanly in the grass, others tucked against roots and stone. You could see where the frost had pulled back from their rims and left a darker outline. Whoever, whatever had made them had done so with a geometry that felt deliberate. Dom, practical as he is, tried to take a rut and match it to the tire marks, hypothesizing somebody with a field test rig. The kid from the feed store walked around the largest circle and said, "There's no compaction difference." He squatted and ran his fingers through the soil, then stood and said, "No scorch, no oil, no metal filings." He looked at us as if we were the ones who'd misplaced the sense that things have causes. We called the county. Sheriff's deputies came, polite and stiff, took pictures, asked us the obvious questions. Time, witnesses, did we touch anything? And then they smiled that smile that tries to be cheerful about being slightly unmoored by the world. They chalked circles on the dirt for their notes and left their own set of footprints that broke the perfect rims we'd been curating with our feet. The deputy said she'd radio the state extension office and maybe get some soil tested, but it would be days. Labs had backlogs. I watched the deputy's flashlight sweep, and for the first time since I'd left the barn, I felt small in a way that had nothing to do with being a farmer. The orchard had turned into something bigger than our explanation. That night, I sat on the porch with a thermos of bad coffee and listened. The dogs had gone to the neighbor's place. They wouldn't stay on our property. The orchard lights I put up for winter came on in the yard, but they were weak and ordinary. I watched the tree line where the flickers had been and half expected the pale light to show itself again, come floating between trunks like a quiet question. It didn't. In the morning, the circles were the same as the night before. Neat depressions in the earth, like placeholders for something that hadn't bothered to leave anything else. The soil didn't smell odd, and the worms were still there when I dug down a little, wriggling and oblivious. We fed the animals and loaded the cider press and cracked jokes about modern art in an apple orchard and how the county needed to get off its hands and install surveillance. But the details nagged. My watch still read two different things for the same night. The deputy's camera had a single frame in the folder, corrupted right when the circles were first reported. The guy from the extension office called and asked for samples. He asked carefully if anyone had noticed any smell, any heat, anything electrical. I told him no, that it felt mostly like a presence. He said he'd be out in a few days. We went about the work, pruning, boxing, the little rituals that anchor a season. The circles stayed quietly neat, and people started to walk their edges like pilgrims, leaving small offerings of tape measures and notepads and coffee cups. A blogger from the city took pictures and wrote a piece that got the phrase "crop circles of the orchard" stuck in people's mouths, which made us all a little nauseous and a little amused. Tourists came and left. The circles didn't multiply in daylight. A week later, one of the circles had a new feature, a faint ring of lighter grass inside the darker, compressed soil. It looked like a bruise healing. The deputy called to say someone at the state lab had found a trace mineral concentration that didn't match typical Hudson Valley dirt, and that was as close as the professionals got to saying anything interesting. Minimal, she added, like someone trying not to make us feel any more unsettled than we already were. I stopped sleeping well. I'd get up at odd hours and walk the lane like a man watching a barn burn, thinking if he keeps watching, the worst will make sense. The lights didn't come back for me. I never actually saw the pale flicker again, not clearly like that first night. Sometimes in the deeper dark, I'd think I saw a movement between trunks and then nothing. The circles stayed, mute and geometrical, as if waiting for something to occupy them. A month later, the orchard looked ordinary enough in the day. Rows of bare branches and racks of ladders. At night, the county installed a motion camera at the back of the lower block. Its night footage was neat and mechanical, deer, a fox, the odd tractor. It picked up nothing of the pale light. The official report filed unidentified impressions and recommended continued observation. That felt like a bureaucrat's way of putting a hand on a hot plate and walking away. We harvest because that's what you do. You pick in rain and in frost, and when your back complains, because time is the only honest thing out here. The circles are still there if you know where to look, tucked in at the roots like something that has been left on purpose. And once in a while I walk the rows toward them and stand with my hands in my pockets and listen to the orchard breathing. The dogs have long ago stopped coming with me. I don't blame them. The land is ours, but some nights it feels like it's keeping a secret that only shows itself in the dark. It was a little after 9 on a Tuesday night when I went for that run in Cobb's Hill Park in Rochester. It was early spring, that weird time when it's still cold enough that you can see your breath, but the snow's melted enough that the trails aren't slippery anymore, just muddy. I'd been doing late runs after work because the park's quiet then. Hardly anyone around, just the sound of your feet on gravel and the hum of traffic from Monroe Avenue in the distance. That night I parked near Lake Riley Lodge, stretched by the lampposts, and started my loop up the hill. The sky was overcast. No moon, just that dull orange glow from the city reflecting off the clouds. The park lights along the lower path flickered every so often, which they always did. It wasn't eerie then. It was just normal. I remember noticing right away how still everything felt once I started heading into the wooded part. Usually, you hear at least some noise. Crickets, rustling, cars, something. But it was quiet, like everything had paused. I figured maybe the air was heavy, like before rain. My headphones died about halfway up the hill, and I didn't bother turning around. I thought maybe I'd just enjoy the silence. I was about 20 minutes in, somewhere near that clearing where the radio tower is visible through the trees, when I saw the first light. It was faint, red, kind of low to the ground, and at first I thought it was a bike reflector or maybe a distant tail light from the road below. But when I squinted, I realized it wasn't steady. It was pulsing, slow and uneven. I slowed to a jog, trying to get a better look, but it was hard to tell what I was seeing. Then another red light appeared beside it, a few feet to the left, hovering in the trees. The two of them blinked, not together, not in a pattern, just off and on, like they were drifting slightly. I stopped completely. That's when the first weird thing happened. The lights shifted. It wasn't that they got brighter or closer, but they seemed to reorient, like both of them turned toward me. It sounds ridiculous saying that, but that's exactly how it felt. Like they had been facing some other direction, then suddenly aligned to look straight at me. I told myself it had to be someone's drone. That made the most sense. People flew those around the reservoir sometimes. So I waved my arm and said, "Hey," kind of half laughing, waiting for whoever it was to respond or bring it down. Nothing. The lights didn't move away, didn't get closer. They just hovered, steady and silent. I started jogging again, telling myself to stop staring. But after maybe a minute, I glanced over my shoulder, and they were still there. Same distance, same height, moving just enough to stay between the trees. That's when the nerves started. I sped up a bit, hitting that downward slope near the upper reservoir. The ground was wet, and I could hear my shoes squishing. When I looked left again, there were 3 of them now. 3 red lights lined up unevenly, gliding through the dark. No sound, no branches breaking, nothing. Every time I stopped, they'd stop too. I tried testing it. I'd run for 10 seconds, stop suddenly, same thing. Still there. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, reflections from something in the distance. But they weren't behaving like reflections. They were moving with me, always keeping the same angle, like they were tracking my position. By the time I hit the bottom of the hill again, I could see my car through the trees. That's when I noticed that all the lamppost lights in the lower lot were off. Every single one. The whole area was dark except for the faint glow from the houses across the street. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, breathing hard, staring up at the row of dead lamps. I've run that park for years, and I've never seen them all go out at once. When I looked back toward the woods, the red lights were closer. Much closer. Maybe 50 feet away, moving between the trees in slow, measured arcs. It didn't feel random anymore. It felt intentional, like they were adjusting to my position. I walked backward toward my car, my keys already in my hand. I didn't take my eyes off the tree line. I didn't want to turn my back. The lights stayed just inside the shadowed part of the woods, like they were holding a line. When I reached the car, I hit unlock, and the headlights came on automatically. For a split second, the beams hit something reflective in the trees. Not just red now, but silver, like metal catching light. Then it vanished. I mean, instantly. The headlights didn't even flicker. I jumped in, started the engine, and pulled out so fast I nearly clipped the curb. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw one faint red light hanging above the lot, higher than before, motionless. It stayed there until I turned onto Culver Road and lost sight of it behind the trees. I drove straight home, hands shaking the whole time. I kept checking my mirrors, but there was nothing behind me. The city felt normal again. Streetlights, people walking dogs, cars at intersections. It made the whole thing feel weirdly distant, like I'd imagined it. When I got home, I sat in my car for a while with the engine running. I didn't want to go inside right away. I checked the time on my phone. It was 10:04 p.m. My run had started a little after 9. The whole thing couldn't have lasted more than 40 minutes, but it felt longer, like something was missing between leaving the trail and getting to the lot. Later, I told my friend Mike about it. He's into drones, so I thought maybe he could explain it. He asked what the lights looked like, and when I said they were pure red, no green, no white, no strobe pattern, he frowned. He said that all consumer drones have to display navigation lights by law, and they blink in set sequences. Mine didn't. They pulsed irregularly, like a heartbeat. That weekend, I went back in the daytime to see if there was anything in that part of the woods, maybe some equipment or reflectors or something that could explain it. There was nothing. Just the usual pines, mud, and a couple of old beer cans near the clearing. No sign of drones, no footprints besides mine from the night before. I tried to convince myself it was just some kids messing with lights or a fluke with the power, but there's one detail that still bothers me. When I looked up at the lamppost nearest where I'd parked, the glass housing around the bulb was cracked, like a thin line straight across the front, almost a perfect semicircle. None of the other lamps had that. A week later, I went for another run, earlier this time, right before sunset. There were more people around, a couple walking dogs, another jogger with a headlamp. Nothing unusual. But when I hit that same spot near the radio tower, I stopped for a drink and looked out through the trees. The light was back. Just one this time, faint red, hovering low between two trunks. It didn't move at first. Then, very slowly, it drifted sideways, out of sight. I haven't run there at night since. I tell myself I'm just being cautious, but the truth is, every time I drive past that park after dark, I can't help scanning the trees for that color, soft red, steady and soundless, like it's still there, waiting for me to stop and look long enough for it to notice me again. It was early October when I hiked out to the cliffs near Montauk Point. The weather had just turned cool, and the air off the Atlantic had that heavy, wet bite that sticks to your clothes. I'd gone out there on a Friday afternoon after work. I'm a surveyor for Suffolk County, and figured I'd walk the coastal trail for an hour or so before sunset. I'd been having trouble sleeping, and being near the water always helped. By the time I parked near the old radar tower and started down the trail, the fog was already rolling in from the ocean. The sky was gray but still light, maybe an hour from dusk. I was the only car in the gravel lot. Even the fishermen who usually hang around that area were gone. The cliffs there aren't huge, 30-40 feet above the water, but the drop looks worse when the tide's rough. The surf was loud that day, echoing up from below, and I could smell the salt and seaweed thick in the air. I remember thinking it felt like rain, but it never came. I walked east for maybe half a mile until the trail got narrow and overgrown. The fog started to thicken, so I stopped near a section of rock that jutted out toward the ocean. There's an old wooden fence there, half rotted and leaning, meant to keep people from getting too close to the edge. I climbed over it anyway and sat down on a flat rock facing the water. For a while, it was just the sound of waves and the faint creak of wind through the grass behind me. The visibility dropped fast. Within 10 minutes, the ocean below was just a moving sheet of white. You could barely tell where the water ended and the fog began. That's when I noticed the light. At first I thought it was the reflection of a boat. It was faint, a soft orange-white glow deep in the mist, maybe a few hundred yards out from the cliff base. I figured it was some fishing trawler heading toward the point, its lights diffused by the fog. I didn't think much of it, but it wasn't moving like a boat. It wasn't swaying or bobbing with the waves. It was just still. I squinted, trying to focus through the mist, and after a few seconds I realized it wasn't sitting on the water either. It was hovering just above it. Not high, maybe 10 or 20 feet, but enough that I could see the faint shimmer of the ocean underneath. It didn't have a clear shape, not at first. The glow seemed to pulse a little, not flashing or strobing, just slowly brightening and dimming, like someone breathing. There was no sound, no engine, no chop of a propeller, nothing. The waves were crashing hard below, but the light didn't move with them. It was fixed in place. I took out my phone to try and record it, but the screen immediately fogged up. I wiped it off with my sleeve, but the moisture in the air was so thick it kept misting over. I managed to get the camera open, but when I pointed it toward the ocean, the lens couldn't focus. The glow was there, but faint, like a distant streetlight behind heavy fog. I thought maybe I'd adjust the zoom, but before I could, something about the light changed. It stretched. It didn't rise or fall. It just elongated vertically, like it was drawing itself upward out of the water. It got taller, thinner, and brighter until it was this column of light, still hazy, but definitely solid in shape. Then, almost instantly, it condensed back down into a sphere, about the size of a small car. I stood up then, phone forgotten in my hand. I don't know why, but I felt this strange pressure in my ears, the way you do in an airplane before it equalizes. It wasn't painful, just noticeable. The air felt heavier. The glow shifted again, a soft red, then back to white. And then it started to move. Slowly, silently, it began gliding closer toward the cliffs. It didn't come fast or aggressively, more like it was drifting. I could see it more clearly now, cutting through the fog in this eerie, smooth motion. No flicker, no sway. When it got maybe 50 yards from the shore, it stopped again, hovering perfectly still. I remember looking down at my feet, trying to steady myself, and realizing I couldn't hear the waves anymore. The wind was still blowing against my jacket, but the sound of the ocean was gone. Completely gone. It was just this strange, soft hum in the air, low enough that I wasn't sure if it was real or just inside my head. I called out, "Hey, hello," because part of me still thought it might be some drone or Coast Guard tech I hadn't heard about. No response. The light didn't move, didn't react. Then it rotated. That's the only word I can think of. The sphere turned like it had a front and a back, though I couldn't tell any difference in the glow. It was a smooth, deliberate motion, and then this part stuck with me. It tilted slightly downward, like it was looking right at me. I froze. The hum got louder for maybe 3 seconds, just enough that I could feel it in my chest, and then it stopped completely. No sound, no movement. I don't know how long we sat like that. Me on the cliff, it hovering out over the water. Could have been 30 seconds, could have been 5 minutes. My sense of time kind of fell apart. Then, without warning, it shot straight upward. Not fast like a flare or a plane. Instant. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, disappearing into the clouds above. There was no contrail, no ripple in the air, no echo. The fog just closed back in like nothing had ever been there. The sound of the ocean came back slowly after that. I realized I was shaking and that my phone was still in my hand. I looked at the time, 6:43 p.m. I checked it against the timestamp on the photo I'd taken just before the light stretched, and it said 6:25. 18 minutes, though it hadn't felt that long. When I finally got back to the parking lot, my car windows were beaded with condensation. I sat there for a while, trying to warm my hands and figure out what I'd seen. I called my friend Danny, who works at the marina in Amagansett, and asked if there'd been any boats out that night with strong deck lights. He said no one was out there. Conditions were too foggy, and the Coast Guard had advised against it. I didn't tell him exactly what I saw, just that I'd seen a light. When I got home later, I checked the photo. It's nothing, just a gray blur with a faint amber tint in the middle. Could be anything. The video didn't save right. It just froze a few seconds in, audio cutting out halfway through. For a few nights after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I drove near the water or saw fog rolling in, I'd catch myself scanning the horizon for that glow again. Nothing. A week later, I went back out there around the same time of day. It was clear that evening. Calm water, orange sunset, perfect visibility. I stood in the same spot by the fence and looked out over the ocean. Just wind, waves, and gulls. No hum, no glow. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something odd in the dirt near the fence post. 3 small impressions in the soil, round, maybe an inch deep, spaced evenly apart like the points of a triangle. Could have been from anything. I crouched to look closer, but the dirt was too dry to tell how old they were. When I looked back out at the horizon, the sun had dropped behind a thin layer of haze. For a second, the reflection on the water shimmered in the same way that light had. Slow, pulsing. I stood there until it faded completely, then started walking back toward the car, not looking over my shoulder again. I haven't gone back to Montauk since. But every so often, when I'm driving home late along the Sunrise Highway and the fog comes in from the coast, I'll catch a faint, soft glow over the water in my side mirror. It's probably just the lighthouse or a plane's landing light catching the mist. Probably.